The subcommittee will come to order, and I want to welcome all of you to this extremely important hearing. Today we are here to listen and learn from the brave men and women from China who have been and are at the forefront of advocating for freedom and human rights and against the tyranny and oppression of the state. Today we seek advice and counsel as to what can and must be done by the Congress, by the President, and the American people, and all people of goodwill worldwide to mitigate the hate and gross mistreatment meted out by the government of China against its own citizens. Today we appeal to Beijing: ease up, respect fundamental human rights and the sanctity of human life, and honor your commitments and the rule of law. Chen Guangcheng and his equally courageous wife, Yuan Weijing, have paid and continue to pay an extraordinarily high price for their benign defiance of a dictatorship that violates human rights with impunity and crushes human dignity. Not only have the Chens endured numbing isolation and unspeakable torture over the course of several years, but now, as we all know, in a pathetic display of PRC governmental revenge, Chen's nephew, young Chen, languishes in a Chinese prison while other members remain at risk. Shockingly, young Chen Guangcheng has been brutally tortured and threatened, as Guangcheng notes today in his testimony, with life imprisonment if he appeals his conviction. Undeterred, Mr. Chen Guangcheng continues to gently raise his clear and consistent voice on behalf of all victims while pushing systemic reform of egregiously flawed political institutions and people who persecute and repress. Blind since childhood, Mr. Chen bore all the burdens and disadvantages that a disabled person faces in rural China. Confronted with the denial of his rights, he developed an intense interest in law and challenged the local government, winning his case. Hearing of Mr. Chen's success, other individuals in Shandong province were inspired to seek his legal assistance in securing redress and vindication. Almost everywhere, corrupt officials made and continue to make life miserable for those struggling to survive. Mr. Chen formed many of their rights and helped them seek durable remedies. He helped many of them see that the rule of just and compassionate law wasn't just for the privileged few, but for everyone. Victimized, yet unbroken by beatings and torture, 51 months of nightmarish incarceration, preceded by house arrests and followed by 18 months more, cut short only by his escape, Chen Guangcheng tenaciously defended Chinese women and babies oppressed by China's draconian one-child policy. Mr. Chen's brilliant mind, his indomitable spirit, and unimaginable courage exposed pervasive forced abortion, deemed a crime against humanity at the Nuremberg Nazi War Crimes Tribunal, and was relentless in using his self-taught legal skills to protect the innocent, especially women. Unfazed by both the difficulty of the task or the inherent risks, Mr. Chen employed legal strategies to combat this insidious government cruelty towards women and children, and argued that his clients in Lingyi, and all women in China for that matter, have rights that prohibit such violence, that they indeed deserve better. China, or Chen, I should say, in China, became and remains their hero. It took a blind man to really see the injustice of a population control program that makes most brothers and sisters illegal, and to hear the desperate cries of Chinese women. It took a blind man, the great Chen Guangcheng, to open the eyes of a blind world to these human rights violations systematically inflicted on Chinese women. Mr. Chen's daring escape to the U.S. Embassy, his miraculous evasion of China's ubiquitous secret police en route, is the stuff of legend and superheroes. His dramatic testimony by telephone from a hospital to 2 emergency hearings that I chaired, and if it wasn't for Bob Fu, we would have never gotten through to him. Bob placed those calls, did it during the course of a couple of days, finally got through, and we heard Chen's voice right here in this room speak out and ask for freedom and ask to come to the United States. Gong He is here today to remind us in the world of another brave and extraordinary hero, her husband, Gao Zhisheng. With great love and a broken heart, this remarkable woman has worked unceasingly to secure the freedom of her husband. Gao Zhisheng is an attorney who played a leading role among Chinese human rights lawyers that defended those that the Chinese government persecutes most harshly, conducting their defense by demanding that the prosecution conformed to law. Mr. Gao is a quintessential example of a human rights defender. In 2005, after he took on politically sensitive cases, Mr. Gao wrote open letters to both the National People's Congress and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, calling for an end to the torture of members of persecuted religious groups. Mr. Gao's license to practice law was subsequently revoked, his law firm shut down, and his family placed on police surveillance. In August of 2006, Mr. Gao was apprehended and then charged with, quote, inciting subversion. He was convicted and given a suspended 3-year sentence with 5 years probation, effectively placing him under house arrest. In September of 2007, Mr. Gao wrote an open letter to the United States Congress in which he described widespread human rights abuses in China, in which he called China's birth control policy the largest genocide in the history of mankind, and related the government's harsh treatment of him and his family. He was consequently detained and tortured for 50 days. His captors called him a traitor, and they warned him that he would be killed if he told anyone about being abducted and tortured. In February of 2009, Mr. Gao was forcibly taken away from his home in Shaanxi province by public security personnel. He briefly resurfaced only in late March of 2010, more than a year later. During his brief reappearance, however, Mr. Gao gave several interviews to foreign media, disclosing the details of his torture. The next month, he disappeared again. In testimony at a China Commission hearing that I chaired last February, Gao said that her daughter, Grace, Gao Zhisheng's absence has caused my daughter severe emotional anguish. She often dreams that her father is dead. She said, my son has tears in his eyes on Father's Day. We were forced to endure rumors that the guards had tortured Zhisheng to death. In late 2011, Gao was secretly transferred to a distant Xiaoyu County prison in the Aksu district of Xinjiang. He has seen his family only twice in the 16 months and for only 30 minutes each visit. Police have prohibited family members from asking him any information about himself. But again, in an account of Mr. Gao's torture that was made public by the Associated Press in January of 11, he disclosed to the reporter the excruciating details of his detention. It said, in part, the police stripped Gao Zhisheng bare and pummeled him with handguns in holsters. For 2 days and nights, they took turns beating him and did things he refused to describe. He recalled, for 48 hours, my life hung by a thread. Authorities reportedly threatened to kill Mr. Gao and to dump his body in a river. And authorities taunted him by saying, you must forget that you are human. Well, we don't forget. And to President Xi, we will not forget Gao Zhisheng, not now, not ever. And we appeal to you to release him. And again, to ease up and respect fundamental human rights. I now yield to my friend and colleague, Mrs. Bass, for any opening comments you might have.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening today's hearing on a topic of utmost importance. You continue to demonstrate your commitment to human rights issues, particularly in China. I want to offer my gratitude to today's witnesses for your testimony. I'm particularly pleased that Mr. Chen was able to join us, and I hope that you found some level of peace during your stay here. Mr. Chen, I don't have to remind you that at this time last year, we all watched news reports of your situation with deep interest. While you're safely with us today, your extended family and fellow countrymen and women experienced terrible human rights violations that remind us that there is still work left to do. The current human rights situation in China is precarious. An increasing number of individuals and organizations risk police monitoring, detention, and arrests simply for seeking an open, free, and just society. Internet and press censorship are widespread, corruption continues to run rampant, and minority social groups often lack access to legal redress. The measure in health of a society is based on the treatment of its citizens, and it's my hope that as China continues to expand its global presence, that it will openly and honestly address human rights as a top government priority. It's the responsibilities of governments everywhere to uphold the basic rights of liberty, life, and justice. Whether we are American, Chinese, or otherwise, it is our duty as representatives of government to ensure that our citizens never have to suffer persecution or censure for what they believe. International compacts such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights share a vision of a free world in which every man, woman, and child can practice their beliefs openly, freely, openly call for transparent and responsible government, and have access to justice systems that uphold the rule of law for all parties. Such compacts must guide us in ensuring that the rights of all people are upheld. One critical way to promote global human rights is by investing in the United Nations. I'm strongly committed to ensuring and preserving this participation. It's my hope that our witnesses will not only give us a better understanding of the situation in China, but will also offer constructive ways that we can move toward the vision of an open, free, and just global society. Thank you, and I look forward to today's testimonies.
Ms. Bass, thank you very much for your eloquent statement. I'd like now to yield to Mr. Meadows.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and truly for each one of you to show up and testify and to illuminate this very disturbing trend as we have a global economy. It is so important for us to look at the global situation as it relates to human rights. We can remember some back in the 1700s, there was a theologian and someone fighting against human rights violation of slavery in England back then by the name of John Newton. And he penned a hymn called Amazing Grace, which says, "I was blind, but now I see." How fitting it is today to have someone who is blind, who is helping us see the atrocities that are happening even today in this global economy. And I just want to thank you for your boldness, for your courage to stand up and make sure that those who have no voice have a voice today. And I look forward to your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meadows. Mr. Barra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing. I share your concern over human rights abuses as well as your commitment to fight these abuses worldwide. One fundamental right is freedom over one's own body and the right of women to control their own reproductive decisions. That is an issue of individual liberty. As a doctor, this issue is particularly important to me. I took an oath to answer my patients' questions, to provide them with various options, to explain the risks and benefits of these choices, and then empower them to make the best decision that fits with their own faith, family, and personal circumstances. This is a fundamental to the doctor-patient relationship. That's why I have concerns about China's one-child policy. It goes against the fundamental value of individual liberty and freedom. While forced abortions and sterilization are illegal in China, they still happen with frequency, and the one-child policy perpetuates these practices. All champions of human rights should openly condemn China's one-child policy and the illegal practices of forced abortion and coerced birth control reported in some localities. The continued oppression of Chinese families through coercive reproductive policies must end. But claiming that the UN Population Fund supports these coercive practices and using the claim to oppose U.S. support of international family planning programs is disingenuous, unmerited, and bad global health policy. In fact, the best way to promote the basic human right of individual choice is to invest in programs like the United Nations Population Fund. UNFPA's programs save and improve the lives of millions of women and men worldwide. They enable couples to voluntarily determine the timing, number, and spacing of their children and voluntary birth control. Independent experts have confirmed that UNFPA does not support the one-child policy in China, nor does it support forced sterilization. UNFPA supports increased access to reproductive health services, improved approaches to adolescent reproductive health, and safe pregnancy and delivery. Its programs have reduced maternal mortality, provided emergency assistance in refugee situations, and prevented and treated HIV and AIDS. As a doctor and public health expert, this is good public health policy. The U.S. should remain a strong supporter and leader within the global community in order to best promote women's rights and the freedom of every woman to make personal decisions about her health and her future. Individual liberty and freedom are American values that are worth fighting for, both here domestically and throughout the world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Stockman.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to briefly say that I saw firsthand a clip of a late-term abortion in China which was forced against the mother's will. And you can't watch this clip. One day I hope we can introduce it as evidence. Without weeping and crying, the mother was heartbroken. She wanted the child. And then they threw the dead baby onto the bed because they weren't allowed to pay for the burial, and threw it on her bed and said, "You have to pay for it." I'm so honored that we're having this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for opening up for many of the people. I hope the United States will tune in and listen to what's going on in China. Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stockman. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a lot to add except to say thank you to Mr. Chen. Helen Keller once said that there's none so blind as he who will not see, and I too appreciate and echo my colleague Mark Meadows' comments about we're glad he's here to help us see. We look forward to the testimony. Now yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now yield to the chairman of the Lantos Human Rights Commission, but also the subcommittee chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, especially as it relates to the Justice Department, Congressman Frank Wolf, who has been a longtime leader in the area of human rights, especially as it relates to China.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just submit my statement. I thank you for having the hearing, and I want to thank Mr. Chen and the rest of the witnesses for being here, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say. Yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Wolf. Let me introduce our witnesses and in the order that I would ask them to present their testimony, beginning first with Chen Guangcheng. As we all know, blind from an early age and self-taught in law, Mr. Chen is frequently described as a barefoot lawyer who advocates for the victims of forced abortion and sterilization and the welfare of women and the poor and for those who are disabled. On April 22nd, 2012, Mr. Chen escaped house arrest and fled to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. After negotiations with the Chinese government, he left the embassy for medical treatment. On May 2nd and on May 19th, Mr. Chen and his wife and children were granted U.S. visas and departed to Beijing on a commercial flight, arriving in New York City on the same day. He currently resides in New York City with his family and is a huge giant when it comes to human rights advocacy, as we all recognize around the world. We'll then hear from Pastor Bob Fu, who was one of the leading voices in the world for persecuted church in China. He was born and raised in mainland China and graduated from the School of International Relations of People's University in Beijing. He later taught English to Communist Party officials at the Beijing Administrative College and Beijing Party School of the Chinese Communist Party from 1993 to 1996. He pastored a house church in Beijing until he and his wife were jailed for 2 months for what was called illegal evangelism in 1996. Mr. Fu and his wife, Heidi, fled to the United States as religious refugees in 1997. Mr. Fu founded the China Aid Association in order to draw international attention to China's gross human rights violations against house church Christians. Pastor Fu is a research PhD candidate at Durham University, and he is awarded a number of important citations for his work on behalf of human rights. We'll then hear from Gang Hu, who is the wife of human rights lawyer Gao Zhisheng. Ms. Gang completed her university studies in accounting in China. She and Gao married in August of 1990. Between 2000 and 2006, she worked as a paralegal and accountant at a Beijing law firm, a law firm founded and directed by her husband. In March 2009, a month after Chinese officials reportedly detained her husband, Ms. Gang escaped from China with her 2 kids. Since arriving in the U.S., she has advocated tenaciously on behalf of her husband and other victims of human rights violations in China through interviews, appeals, and appeared before our committee, or commission, I should say, the China Commission, back last February. So thank you for coming back to, again, reappeal on behalf of your husband. We'll then hear from Jared Genser, who is the founder of Freedom Now, an independent nonprofit organization that works to free prisoners of conscience worldwide. Mr. Genser has taught semester-long seminars at the UN Security Council at Georgetown, University Law Center, and the University of Michigan and the University of Pennsylvania Law Schools. His pro bono clients have included former Czech Republic President Václav Havel and Nobel Peace Prize laureates Aung San Suu Kyi, Leo Chabot, Desmond Tutu, and Elie Wiesel. Mr. Genser holds a BS from Cornell and MPP from Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government and a JD cum laude from the University of Michigan Law School. He's also a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and is also representing Mr. Chen's nephew as well as Gao Zhisheng. We'll then hear from no stranger to this committee, a good friend, Deet Kumar, who is the Director for International Advocacy at Amnesty International USA. Mr. Kumar has served as a human rights monitor and as a director of refugee camps around the world. He often testifies before the Congress and lectures at Foreign Service Institute, where U.S. diplomats are trained. He also served as a professor at Washington Colleges of Law's Humanitarian and Human Rights Academy. He has monitored elections with former President Carter around the world and served as judge of elections in Philadelphia. He also served as a consultant to the UN Quaker Mission. Mr. Kumar was a political prisoner for over 5 years himself in Sri Lanka for his peaceful human rights activities. He started his legal studies in prison and eventually became an attorney at law and devoted his entire practice to defend political prisoners. The floor is yours, Chen Guangcheng.
好，尊敬的国会外交委员会、全球人权委员会主席史密斯议员、各位外委会议员、各位来宾朋友们，大家好。
Dear Honorable Chairman Smith, honorable members of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, ladies and gentlemen, friends, greetings.
这个房间让我记忆犹新。
This room helps me remember things from the past.
今天和去年不一样，我能站在这儿，我能坐在这儿了。
I'm very grateful that this year I'm actually here.
首先，我要求将这份名单上的恶官依法列入禁止入境美国的人员名单之中。
Here I request to include this list of names of prosecutors to be excluded from entering the United States.
并切实执行，
And
并得到切实执行啊！
and be reinforced.
名单中的恶官库利氏，我的这份名单，你给他，给我。好，
The names are.
对，这是一份。 这份名单上的官员长期参与对我和我一家人的残酷迫害。
The officials whose name are on this list have continuously in the past persecuted me and my family.
2005年12到13万的强制暴力堕胎中，以及60多万的对家属的株连，都有这些恶官的。 他的恶官的手上都沾满着鲜血。
These corrupt officials, they have this blood on their hands in all this forced abortions. 60,000. Oh, 130,000 forced abortions.
去年的这个时候啊，我全家正处在十分危险中。
Last year around this time, my entire family was in the midst of grave danger.
4月底。 我逃离虎口，几经周折， 我逃到美国驻北京使馆，寻求紧急避险。
At the end of April 2012, I escaped from the Valley of the Shadow of Death, and after multiple twists and turns, I fled to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing to seek emergency refuge from danger.
5月2日，我在中美协商并达成协议的保障下，只得走出使馆。
On May 2nd, after Sino-U.S. negotiation had reached an agreement guaranteeing my safety, I left the U.S. Embassy in Beijing.
当时美方谈判官员告诉我，达成的协议会正式的写入中美的外交文件里。
At that time, the U.S. officials taking part in the negotiations told me that the agreement they had reached would be written down in Sino-U.S. diplomatic documents.
我当时的主要要求写在了给温总理的信件和我那时公布的视频里。
My main requests were contained both in my letter to then Premier Wen Jiabao and in my pre-recorded video that was released to the public.
简单的说是，立即停止对我和我家人及帮助过我的亲友的一切不法侵害。
The requests in short were this: an immediate end to all illegal acts of persecution against me, my family members, and my supporters.
保障我们的所有公民权利，
Protection of all our civil rights.
并对数年来迫害我和我家人的违法犯罪行为展开彻底调查，作出公开处理。
And a thorough investigation into the illegal and criminal acts of persecution by the Shandong authorities over many years against me and my family, and a public resolution to the matter.
不管涉及到的官员职位有多高，人数有多少，只要违法犯罪，必须依法追究。
Regardless of how high-ranking these officials involved were, nor how many officials were involved, if they had committed a crime, they must be held accountable.
并对造成的损失进行赔偿。
And compensation should be made for the losses incurred.
但遗憾的是，到目前为止，不但中共中央政府向我和美国政府做出的这个承诺没有兑现，反而把我的侄子陈可贵非法拘押、非法审判后，在2012年的11月30日，以所谓故意伤害罪判刑39个月，并送到当年我所在的同一所监狱——临沂监狱关押。
Regrettably, to date, not only has the Chinese central government not honored its commitment to the U.S. government, it has instead illegally detained and put on trial my nephew, Chen Guangcheng, and on November 30th, 2012, convicted Chen Guangcheng on the charge of so-called intentionally inflicting injuries and sentenced him to a prison term of 3 years and 3 months. Moreover, Chen Guangcheng has been sent to the same prison in Linyi City where I was tortured when I was illegally sentenced on trumped-up charges in 2006.
2012年的4月26号深夜12点以后，
On April 26, 2012, in midnight,
山东党委得知我逃离山东东势谷的消息后，
after local government officials discovered that I had escaped,
半夜由分管政法的副书记带着一群雇来的流氓，有几十人，带着凶器翻墙跳入我大哥家，也就是陈可贵家。
the Deputy Communist Party Secretary Zhang Jian of Shuangho, who was in charge of politics and law, led a few dozen club-wielding men in climbing over the courtyard wall of my elder brother's home.
几十个人分头，同时砸开各个房间的门，实施打抢。
They broke the lock of the courtyard gate from inside and let more men and broke down all the doors in the house.
有的人从里边把大门锁破坏，放进更多的人。
They let in more men after they broke the lock.
然后这些人冲到我大哥屋里，将还没有穿好衣服的我大哥从床上拖下来，套上黑头套，然后拧起胳膊就拉走，塞进汽车，拉到刑警队。
They dragged my elder brother, who was still in his pajamas, from his bed, pulled a black hood over his head, and twisted his arm and stuffed him into a vehicle and took him to the criminal police section of the Yunnan County Public Security Bureau.
整个过程没有任何法律手续。
No legal procedures were enforced.
在这个刑警队进行了几十个小时的酷刑。据后来我得到的消息说呢，居住在刑警队周围的这个民众都听到了那天晚上对大哥实施酷刑时候他发出的惨叫声。
They tortured him for several dozen hours. According to the accounts of some residents in the vicinity of the police station, they all heard my elder brother's screams as they tortured him that night.
家里他们依然在实施打抢。
They were still looting my elder brother's home at the time.
陈可贵在另一个屋里被打，他的妈妈在不同的房间也在被打。当陈可贵听到他妈妈发出被打的惨叫声，想要去看看的时候，这个就被这些土匪强行阻止在屋里不让出来。
They beat Chen Guangcheng and his mother Ren Zongzhi in different rooms, and they grabbed Ren Zongzhi's hair and beat her so badly.
可贵的身上多处被打伤头上、脸上、脖子上、腿上，到处被打伤，都流血。
Kegu was beaten in so many places and there were bruises over his body.
对，这个在这个时候，陈可贵在被打的再不反抗就要被打死的情况下，不得不拿起菜刀实施自卫。
As a last resort, in order to protect himself, Chen Guangcheng grabbed a knife and then to protect himself against the persecutors.
那么这个时候，他也没有马上对别人攻击，而是威胁他们说：“你们要再打我，因为这个时候可贵已经被打倒好几次了，说你们再打我，我就要还手了。”这个时候，张健就命令那些恶奴说：“把他控制起来。”然后这些恶奴就纷纷冲上来，继续有的拿着棍子，有的拿着儿童车来打陈可贵。
Kegu was not actually attacking them. He was simply telling them that if you continue to beat me, I will have to counterattack. But the Zhang Jian, the head of the security bureau, told the men around him to contain Kegu at the time.
当时这个打陈可贵，有的人举着棍子照着他头上打，他躲开以后，棍子打到桌子上，电视被打坏，然后棍子被打为2段。
The club wielding man attacked Kegu and then tried to hit his head. Instead, they missed him, and then the club actually hit the table, a desk with a TV on it. The TV was smashed.
也就是在这种情况下，陈可贵不得不还手，那么就划伤了他们3个暴徒。其实他们都伤得很轻。
In this kind of a situation, Kegu reacted, and then scratched some of the men that were in the house with a knife.
后来陈可贵便去就这个事情去报警，但是公安几个小时都不再出警。
Kegu reported this incident to the police, but the police never came.
而且后来他们又来打陈可贵的妈妈，那么陈可贵的妈妈当时在床上给可贵的孩子发烧的孩子喂药。那他们就冲进去，一把把他的药丸给打翻，然后抓着他的头发从床上拖下来，就按在床根里，进行长时间的殴打。
Later on, they also beat up Kegui's mother, who was actually taking care of her grandson, who was having a fever. They grabbed her by her hair and grabbed her all the way to the floor and started beating her.
陈可贵的妈妈也就是我的嫂子，被打得受不了的时候，就在喊救命。但是打他的这些人就在说，一边打一边说：“我让你喊救命，我让你喊救命。”
My sister-in-law was beaten to a point. She yelled, "Help! Help!" And then this man said, "So so what does it do that you scream help?"
从这儿开始，这些看守便一直住在他们家里，赖在他们这床上、沙发上不允许别人进来，而且。陈可贵的妈妈喊救命的时候，很多邻居都听见，想来看一看发生了什么事。可是这个时候发现，他们在陈可贵的院子里，以及他院子周围所有的路口都安排了大量雇来的地痞流氓， 手里拿着棍子，拒绝村民靠近他的院子。
The guards, since then, the guards just continued to stay in the house. They stay on the sofa, on the bed, and they were not letting any citizens around in the village to come in. There were thugs everywhere with clubs in their hands.
那么这个案子过后，你看没开。这个时候呢，陈可贵这个案子后来竟然被以故意杀人罪，后来又改成故意伤害罪被抓走关押。
The Trump Dow charges were changed from intentional attempting murder to intentionally inflicting injuries.
在关押的期间，陈可贵受到严重的酷刑，短时间内瘦掉20多斤。
He was cruelly tortured during this time, and while he was imprisoned, he lost around more than 20 kilograms.
宜南县政法委书记兼公安局局长马成莲，还有公安局的政委尹川东，多次到看守所对他实施威胁。
Ma Chenlian and Yin Chuangong, who are the leader of the Security Bureau, threatened Chen Guangcheng many times while he was imprisoned.
并且说呢，这个他如果提起上诉的话，非常有可能被判无期。如果听我们的，按照我们的做，按我们说的做，那就给你判得轻一点。
If you appeal, you would be sentenced to life in prison. But if you listen to me, your sentence may be lighter.
然后还威胁他说：“你的父母、孩子、小命都在我们手心里攥着呢。如果你不听我们的，很有可能你从监狱里出来就看不到他们了。”
And the lives of your children and your parents are in our hands. If you don't listen to us, once you are released from prison, you may never see them again.
那么就在这种情况下，陈可贵也就才出现了后来开庭时候当庭表示不上诉的这样一个结果。
In light of this scenario, Chen Guangcheng decided not to appeal.
整个过程中，他的父母被开庭的时候，他的父母被限制在国宝的车上，不允许下车。
The parents, Guangcheng's parents, were contained in the National Security Bureau's vehicle, and they were not allowed to leave the vehicle.
理由就是说他是证人，不能出庭，但是后来也没允许他作证。
The pretext was that they were witnesses and they're not supposed to leave the vehicle. But later on, they were not actually allowed to testify as witnesses.
现在陈可贵被送进监狱，依然受到如果申诉就会被判无期的威胁。
Up until now, Chen Guangcheng is still under the threat that if he appeals, he will be sentenced to life in prison.
就在2月份会见的时候，陈可贵讲述了他在看守所受到的酷刑，那么就遭到了严重的威胁。
In February, when Chen Guangcheng told the world about what had happened to him, and then he was threatened.
在3月7号的时候，这个当地的计划生育办公室的一个人员叫徐锡才，竟然到他的可贵的孩子所在的幼儿园去，要求把他接走，而且这个幸亏陈可贵的爸爸早一点把孩子接走了，他们没能得逞。
On March 7th, an official from the local family planning office, Xu Xicai, was asked by the local party committee leaders to go to the local kindergarten to remove Chen Guangcheng's 4-year-old son. Fortunately, on that day, Guangcheng's father, which is my eldest brother, Chen Guangfu, was one step ahead of him.
后来，这个校长和陈可贵的父亲一起去问这个徐锡才，究竟谁让他做这件事情？他们说是党委指使。
When the principal of the school went to and
对，徐锡才就是他们去问徐锡才，谁让他们这样做？徐锡才说呢，是党委领导支持。
When they went to ask Xu Xicai who did this, Xu Xicai said it was the Communist Party secretary who asked him to do it.
到31号不是到11号，这个好像是11号吧。这个陈可贵他的父亲送孩子去学校的时候，就有人骑着摩托车，穿着军大衣，戴着头盔，跟在他们后边实施威胁。
On the morning of March 11th, if I remember correctly, my brother Guangfu was taking the child to the school. They were followed by a man in a helmet.
这也就是他们所说的“小命都在他们手里攥着”的含义吧。
This is probably what they meant, that their lives is in their hand. My family's members' lives is in the hands of the authorities.
昨天我才知道，就在陈可贵的孩子差点被接走之前的第9天吧，好像这个张安妮也被4个国宝给从学校接走，造成了很大的威胁。
安妮是你的，
安妮是安徽的一个孩子，10岁的孩子。
Okay.
维权人士的10岁的孩子。
Another a child of a legal defender was also taken away about 9 days after my brother's son was almost taken.
从迫害高志胜的孩子上学问题，到我的孩子不允许上学问题，以及到这个张安妮，以及到现在的陈可贵的孩子问题，我们可以看到这样的一系列的行动是有组织、有预谋的，在党委的直接领导下进行的。
As you can see from the case of my brother, his child was taken from Gao Zhisheng's child being taken, and various other rights defenders' children being taken. You can see that this is actually a planned incident. It was planned by authorities.
总之，我们不能继续容忍中共当局继续言而无信，任意欺骗国际社会。
To sum up, we cannot continue to tolerate the Chinese Communist authorities in continuing to go back on their words and deceiving the international community at will.
像这样，中共中央向我、向美国、向全世界做出承诺的，并且得到世界广泛关注的案件，中共当局都可以随意的撕毁协议。我们怎么能够指望他能够改善其他方面的人权状况，在其他方面能够负起国际责任，担当国际义务呢？
When the Chinese Communist Central Party Committee can act like this in breaking its promises to me, to the United States, and to the whole world, and when it can willfully break agreements in a case that has attracted the world's attention, how can we expect it to improve the human rights situations in other areas and to take up its international responsibilities and obligations?
中共当权者名为国家领导，实为国之劫匪。
The Chinese leaders, they have the title as leaders, but in fact, they are thieves and robbers.
人民不能再接受他们这种绑架国家、挟持政府、用以奴役人民的这样的现实存在了。
As Chinese citizens, we cannot tolerate they kidnapped the country anymore.
对，现在他们在网上限制人民的言论自由，在实际当中限制人们的行动自由。
There's street freedom of speech, there's street freedom of movement.
大家应该齐心协力来推倒共产党限制人民言论自由的这个网络柏林墙。
We should break down the wall that the Chinese Communist government has erected.
在此，我要求主席先生、国会外交关系委员会和国会政府事务监督委员会以及其他相关委员会正式向行政当局相关部门调阅并公开中美就涉及到我这件事情所达成的任何书面和口头的正式外交协议。
I hereby request, Mr. Chairman, the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and other related committees to formally obtain from the relevant departments of the administrative authorities and publish the written and oral diplomatic agreements between China and the United States with regard to this incident of mine.
包括我在美使馆写给温总理的信件等。
Including my letter to Premier Wen Jiabao that I wrote while I was in the U.S. Embassy.
并敦促美国政府郑重要求 中共当权者兑现承诺。
I hereby urge the U.S. government to solemnly demand that the Chinese Communist leaders do as they promised.
主席先生，我请求将下面链接中的文件存入国会永久记录。
Mr. Chairman, I hereby request that this testimony and other written documents I provided be entered into congressional records.
非常感谢。
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chen, thank you very much for your extraordinarily powerful and historic testimony. I can assure you we will follow up on your request and do everything possible to get the administration to be forthcoming and to provide those documents about your, as you called it, your incident. And again, thank you for, and I hope the press will convey this to the world, including the American public, this retaliation against families and against children. Not only are children deemed disposable via the one-child per couple policy, but the dissidents, the way that the communist dictatorship hurts the dissidents the most is by hurting their families. And you have, in a very powerful way, reminded us of that with very specific examples of your own family, including your nephew. So thank you. I'd like to now yield to Pastor Fu.
Mr. Chairman and honorable members of this committee, thank you for conducting this important hearing. As my friend, Mr. Chen Guangcheng, just recalled what had happened barely almost a year ago. I was hearing the desperate cries from the Chaoyang Hospital the first night when Mr. Chen walked out of the U.S. Embassy. And then the next morning, I was here in this hearing room and testifying, and also with that cell phone enabled Mr. Chen to speak to you and this committee and to the American people and to the world about his real intention. The overall situation in mainland China in the past 3 months has been worrying. From the serious air pollution in the capital city of Beijing, the large number of dead pigs that polluted the Yangtze River, and other incidents highlighting the rapid deterioration of China's natural environment, to the situation of freedom of religion, the rule of law, and basic human rights that continues to present a grim picture. They all indicate that the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao political agenda still persists, dominating everything. This being the case, even though Xi Jinping's administration now holds political power in China, people still have reason to worry. Do we have to wait another 10 years before seeing progress in China's human rights record and the rule of law? The wretched state of freedom of religion, the rule of law, and the basic human rights. First of all, the persecution suffered by house churches in China is just one example. In the past 3 months, there has been a troubling series of persecution cases. They occurred in over 10 provinces and 2 municipalities directly under central government jurisdiction, including Beijing, Shanghai, Heilongjiang, etc. One of the cases is Beijing's Shouwang Church, now going into its 3rd year of being forced to hold outdoor worship service, which it began doing on April 10th, 2011. Shouwang believers have been arrested more than 1,000 times, and there have been more than 800 short-term detentions. Their senior pastor, Pastor Jin Tianming, and some church leaders had been under long-term house arrest since April 2011 without stop. And in 2011, the Chinese government issued 2 important secret documents aimed at attacking the Christian faith that were directly responsible for the systematic escalation in the persecution of churches that, that has continued to this day. In September 2011, at the so-called Patriots in Christian Circles training class held by the State Administration for Religious Affairs, a secret document jointly issued by the State Administration for Religious Affairs and the Ministries of Public Security and Civil Affairs was circulated that detailed a plan to eradicate house churches in 10 years. Of course, as we all know, even the most conservative estimate, a number of Chinese Christians has been estimated for more than 80 million. I don't think they will be successful. And of course, they are going to try anyway. Last year, China Aid Association obtained the so-called suggestions for doing a good job of resisting foreign use of religion to infiltrate institutes of higher education and preventing campus religious activities, the so-called document number 18, jointly issued on May 15, 2011, by 6 ministries of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee. The purpose of this secret document was to prevent and attack the spread of Christian faith on campuses. At the same time, the Chinese government continues to employ strict control measures over Catholicism, continuing to ordain clergymen without Vatican approval, which is a serious interference in the internal religious affairs of the Vatican. In 2012, the government forced Bishop Ma Daqin, the Bishop of Shanghai, to disappear because he had openly expressed his loyalty to the Vatican. His whereabouts to date remain unknown. In addition, the tragedy of the self-immolation of Tibetan lamas and nuns continues to play out, demonstrating the persistent worsening of religious freedom in Tibet. On the front of religion, the rule of law, in accordance with the principle held by the Hu-Wen administration that maintaining stability was of a paramount importance, the National People's Congress on March 14, 2012, passed an amendment to the criminal procedure law that went into effect on January 1st this year. One of its articles, Article 73, provides a legal basis for public security agencies to secretly arrest and detain citizens under the pretext of so-called residential surveillance. This is a serious step backwards in the rule of law in China. In January this year, the Public Security Ministry announced that it was suspending the labor camp system. I hope that they will practice what they said, not only suspending, but to stop immediately of this evil system. In its treatment of petitioners, which is a vulnerable group, the government continues to be as brutal as ever, arresting them, locking them up in black jails, beating them, implicating friends and relatives, and employing other illegal measures. And furthermore, the internet freedom is still harshly restricted. In March, the SSH, the Security Shell Network Protocol for secure data communication, was blocked. And this is important evidence that freedom to use the internet has been further restricted, as Mr. Chen repeatedly called to push down this internet, the Beijing's internet Berlin Wall. And unfortunately, I think our Western democracies has done too little and too late almost, I think, to counter the internet circumvention. And you can read the latest article by The Economist magazine. And instead of becoming a tool for freedom of information, and the communist regime in China has used the internet and its censorship to build a wall to be a master of control. And every $1,000 in China that was spent to censor the information on the internet, unfortunately, in the West, especially in the United States, we only spent $1. So it's 1 to 1,000. I think we certainly can do more to promote the internet freedom. And I believe, along, I think, my friend Mr. Chen and many of our dissident friends, and as long as well as millions of Chinese people faith. And when the internet, China's internet Berlin Wall falls, I think that will be the day the freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of association will come. And I think the democracy in China will come also very sooner. And the basic human rights on the bloody cases in China's forcibly enforced one-child family planning policy and forced demolition for residential homes and relocation for residents continue to take place. And on the forced family planning, even the last month, the Ministry of Public Health publicly announced the so-called achievements of the family planning policy in the past 40 years. 330 million abortions performed on Chinese women. What is really distressing is that these bloody numbers continue to climb and that the majority of those abortions were forced on the women by the government. In the United States, you can be pro-life, pro-choice, as the Honorable Congressman Mr. Barrett said. You don't need to agree on everything here, but one thing is very clear. Forced abortion is not a choice. On March 13th, a woman in Henan province who had had a forced abortion was found hanged at a local family planning office with suspicious injuries all over her body. And just this month, we just reported yesterday, there is a woman called Zhao Hongxia, and he already had 2 children. And when she went back for a family visit from another work unit, and she was captured, and then she was forced to do the forced sterilization. And even though her doctors, and with the 2 ultrasounds and various methodologies, showed and warned the family planning official who kidnapped her and told the family planning official it will be deadly for her to engage this forced sterilization. They did it anyway that day on March the 19th, and a few hours later, she was found dead. And we have been advocating on behalf of the following people whose cases have representative values. And besides the cases of Mr. and Attorney Gao Zhisheng and Mr. Chen Guangcheng's case, and I want to mention another case. It's Mr. Zhu Yufu. And at the time of Arab Spring, and Zhu Yufu, a Christian dissident based in Hangzhou, Zhejiang province, wrote a poem and posted on the internet to encourage people to awaken their thinking. As a result, he was summoned by police on March the 5th, 2011, and subsequently in April, he was sentenced to 7 years for one poem for the so-called inciting subversion of state power. Mr. Chairman, today we have 3 of Mr. Zhu Yufu's family members who just recently escaped from China because in their last visit in November of last year, they saw their brother, 60-year-old Mr. Zhu Yufu, was dying. So they were racing to rescue their family members by leaving everything behind in China. So I want you to recognize them, and they are sitting behind me, Mr. Zhu Qiaofu, and Mr. Zhu Xiaoyan, and Mr. Zhu Yanming. They are 3 brothers and sisters of Mr. Zhu Qiaofu. And so I hope members of Congress and the media could help. I made the motion for immediate help. This is a life and death decision. I mean, a moment of time, and I have escorted them in the past few days, and talking with the staff of the staffers within a member of Congress, and all the horrible stories surrounding the family of this brave man. And Mr. Du Yufu has already spent 11 years imprisonment for his democracy activities. And I also request that the addendum to my written testimony be included. And including, in addition to the above, there are 3 other people worth our attention, and Mr. Wang Bingzhang's case, and Mr. Peng Ming. Both of them were prominent dissident leaders who were both kidnapped by the Chinese agents in Vietnam and in Burma in 2002 and 2005, respectively. Both of them had been serving life in prison, life sentence. A third person, of course, is the wife of Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo, Ms. Liu Xia, who had been under house arrest since 2010 without any freedom of movement. And the following the continuing arbitrary detention, the long time imprisonment of other prominent prisoners of conscience, including Mr. Ali Mujiang Yimiti from Xinjiang, Mr. Liu Xianbin from Sichuan, Ms. Yang Rongli from Shanxi province, Professor Guo Quan from Jiangsu province, Mr. Li Bifeng from Sichuan, Mr. Chen Wei from Sichuan, and Mr. Chen Xi also from Sichuan. And I want to actually also point out, we just received yesterday the information from the wife of Mr. Chen Xi, and she learned that her husband, Mr. Chen Xi, also a prominent democracy activist, was sentenced for 7 years during the Jasmine Revolution in 2011. He was being drawn, his blood was being drawn in his prison multiple times recently, which is the indication, and usually for a possible forced death. So we need to watch this case and Mr. Chen Xi very carefully. And finally, I want to also mention the persecution case of the family member of one of my staff, Mark Shan, and his brother, Randy Shan, for simply being working with China Aid Association in the United States, had been persecuted repeatedly and had to flee out of China just in the summer of 2012. And the security forces basically repeatedly threatening him to stop, to using him to force as a hostage to force his brother to work with China Aid. And my appeal is the situation for freedom of religion, the rule of law, and human rights in China has continued to deteriorate following the 18th Party Congress last fall, especially in the first 3 months of this year, which is a cause for continued worries among the international community. And Xi Jinping's administration has been in full control over China for a month already. And we have not seen any encouraging signs of any immediate change. So we need to be alert to help China in the following way from Western democracies. For the U.S. government, we hope that it can make more real progress in the next 4 years than was the case in the past 4 years. The U.S. President and the Secretary of the State ought to have the courage to urge the Chinese government publicly and in unequivocal terms to improve its record on human rights and the rule of law, and to adopt a standard that stresses the value of universal human rights. The U.S. Embassy can officially request permission to visit prisoners of conscience in prison, and it can meet regularly with the family members of these victims, not waiting for them had to escape from China to come here to meet. and also to meet with human rights defenders who are still active in society and provide necessary help. In future human rights dialogues, strategic and economic dialogues, and dialogues with experts in the rule of law, in other major diplomatic activities in the coming months, the U.S. government should grasp these opportunities to unequivocally point out the problems in China's human rights record and the rule of law, and actively assist the Chinese government in implementing real reforms in these areas. We harbor great hope for this. And finally, I ask that the committee to enter the congressional record of ChinaAid 2012 annual report on the Chinese government persecution of Christians and churches in mainland China. Thank you very much.
Pastor Fu, thank you very much. Without objection, all of your full statements and materials you want added to the record will be made a part of the record. And again, I want to thank you, because without you, we would have never heard Chen Guangcheng's voice when he was in a hospital room at the hearing last year. So thank you so very much for your leadership and your testimony, and again, for making that possible. I'd like to now ask Geng Hu if she would provide her testimony.
尊敬的国会人权委员会主席史密斯先生，各位外交委员会委员，各位来宾们，大家好！感谢国会给我这个机会，让我在这个听证会上能为我的先生人权律师高志胜讲话，也感谢诸位大家的关心高志胜的案子。
Dear Congressman Smith, Chairman of the Congressional Human Rights Commission, members of Foreign Affairs Committee and guests, greetings. Let me express my thanks to the Congress for giving me this opportunity at this meeting to speak on behalf of my husband, Gao Zhisheng, a human rights lawyer in China. Let me also express my gratitude to everyone here for showing concern to Gao Zhisheng's case.
自2005年起呢，高志胜呢为受迫害的那个基督徒。 受迫害案跟法轮功受迫害案，还有其他那个团体受迫害案，受到中共当局的公开的打压和迫害，关闭了他的律师事务所，吊销了他的律师执照。
In 2005, Gao Zhisheng began to defend the persecuted Christians, Falun Gong adherents, and other persecuted groups. Because of this, the Chinese communists shut down his law office and revoked his lawyer's license.
在2006年8月15号，中共当局非法绑架了高志胜，并在2006年12月22号以煽动颠覆国家安全罪给高志胜判了3年，缓刑5年。在缓刑的5年期间，就有6次以上的强制失踪，最长的一次达到20个月，每一次的失踪都伴有各种的酷刑。
One day in August 2006, the police illegally kidnapped him. On December 22, 2006, they sentenced Gao Zhisheng to 3 years in prison with also 5 years probation on the charge of inciting to subvert the state power. And during the 5-year probation, Gao Zhisheng was kidnapped and made to disappear by the Chinese police at least 6 times. Among this, the longest disappearance lasted 20 months. Each time he disappeared, he suffered torture.
在2007年9月，高志胜给美国国会写了一份公开信，揭露中共因为举办奥运会残酷迫害人权的案子。为此呢，中共当局呢又给高胜戴上了黑头套，把他绑架了50天。
In September 2007, Gao Zhisheng wrote an open letter to the U.S. Congress in which he exposed the human rights abuses of the Chinese Communist authorities. Because of this, the Communist police put a black hood on Gao Zhisheng's head and kidnapped him, making him disappear, and he was missing for 50 days.
他们把他带到一间黑房子里，强行的扒光了衣服暴打，然后用电警棍。 电击他的全身及生殖器，令他身体剧烈的抖动，身体皮肤被电击棒电击的乌黑，没有一块完整的皮肤。酷刑呢，使他失去了知觉，大小便失禁。
On the same day they kidnapped him. This time they took him to a room, stripped him naked, and brutally beat him. They also hit him all over his body and his genitals with electric batons, so much so that his body shook violently, and the skin on his body became dark. Black. The torture made him lose his consciousness, and he had urine incontinence as a result.
随后呢，警察又用香烟熏他的眼睛和鼻子，用牙签扎他的生殖器。高志胜恳求他们把他关进监狱，以避免酷刑。警察却说想去监狱做梦，我们想让你什么时候消失就让你什么时候消失。事实上，他们果真就这么做了。
At the time, police smoked Gao Zhisheng's eyes with cigarette and inserted a toothpick into his penis. After that, a police officer and lawyer Gao implored them to lock him in a prison to avoid further torture. But the police officer said, "Do you want to go to prison? Do it in your dream. Whenever we want you to disappear, we will do so." In fact, that's what they did.
至今呢，高志胜迫害已经7年了。在这7年中呢，警察住进了我的家里，监视着我和孩子。他们不让女儿上学，还围攻打骂我和孩子。
Now, Gao Zhisheng has been brutally persecuted for 7 years. In these 7 years, the police have lived in my house to supervise me and my children. They didn't allow my daughters to attend school, and they even besieged me and my daughter and beat both of us.
为了女儿能够上学，在2009年元月，在朋友的帮助下，我带着2个孩子逃离了中国。高志胜在2009年2月再次绑架失踪。
I want my children to be able to go to school. I took them with me and escaped from China to the U.S. in January 2009 with the help of some friends. In February 2009, Gao Zhisheng was again kidnapped.
在2010年4月，高志胜失踪了14个月后，短暂的出现过。中共官方呢安排他与美联社的采访，在采访中呢，高志胜没有按照中共给他布置的话去讲话，而是向美联社再次揭露了他这次失踪所遭受的各种细节。之后呢，中共警察就用那个枪坨子打了他2天2夜。用他的话说，这是他所遭受酷刑中最严重的一次，生命危在旦夕。
In April 2010, 14 months after Gao Zhisheng disappeared, the Chinese government made an arrangement for him to accept an interview with the Associated Press. During the interview, he didn't talk as the Chinese Communist government instructed him. Instead, he exposed and described in detail how he suffered torture. After that, the Chinese Communist police officers beat him for 2 days and 2 nights with the handle of a pistol. According to Gao Zhisheng, it was the most brutal torture he ever suffered till then, and his life hung thinly in the air.
那次美联社采访过后的几天呢，高志胜又再次的失踪。在2011年12月，就在高志胜缓刑5年到期的前4天，中共新华社对外发布消息说，高志胜未来3年将在监狱中。随后呢，高志胜在2011年底，被警察秘密押往了那个遥远的新疆阿克苏沙亚县监狱。
Just a few days after the interview with the Associated Press, Gao Zhisheng was again disappeared. He again disappeared. In December 2011, 4 days before Gao Zhisheng's 3-year probation was due, Xinhua News Agency of the Chinese Communist Party published the news. In the next 3 years, Gao Zhisheng would be locked up in the prison. After that, at the end of 2011, Gao Zhisheng was secretly transferred to the faraway Shaya County prison in Akasu district of Xinjiang.
高胜在沙雅县监狱已经关了1年零4个月，在这期间呢，家人只见过他2次，每一次是30分钟。第2次与第1次的见面呢，相隔了10个月。见面时呢，警方禁止家人问高志胜的任何情况，所以到现在来说，我们不知道他的最新情况。
In the 1 year and 4 months Gao Zhisheng was detained in the prison, family members have seen him only twice, and each time the visit lasted only 30 minutes. There was a period of 10 months between the first visit and the second visit. During the visit, the police prohibited the family members to ask any information about him.
2012年8月27号，大哥委托了2位律师李苏斌和李洪斌去见高志胜，但遭到狱方的拒绝。
On August 27, 2012, his elder brother authorized lawyer Li Shubing and Li Xiongбin to meet with Gao Zhisheng, but their request was rejected by the prison authorities.
众所周知，直到现在，高志胜一直是被中共官方严密控制的良心犯。我非常的担忧，因为他长期的失踪，然后又转入到监狱，我们非常担心他的生命状况。我呼吁国际社会能公开的表达对高志胜出现不断的关注，因为这是对他最大的保护。
As you all know, Gao Zhisheng has always been a political prisoner of conscience under the strict control of the Chinese Communist authorities. I'm very concerned that the torture and the long-term detention pose a very serious threat to his life. I hereby call on the international community to persist in paying continuous attention to attorney Gao Zhisheng, as this is probably the greatest protection it can offer to Gao.
今天呢，中共暴政对中国人民进行的残酷迫害，高志胜、胡佳、郭飞雄、郭全、许万平、王登超等人的悲惨经历，就是中共迫害的证明。这些悲惨的故事、残酷的故事，说明中国人民没有人权和法治，没有自由和民主。我希望国际社会能像营救陈光诚一样营救高志胜及上述人员。谢谢。
Today, the Chinese tyrannical communists are still brutally persecuting the Chinese people. The miserable experience of Gao Zhisheng, Hu Jia, Guo Feixiong, Xu Wanping, Wang Dengchao, and others is clear evidence of the persecution by the Chinese communists. These brutal facts have demonstrated that the Chinese people don't have human rights, rule of law, freedom, or democracy. I hope the international community can rescue the above-mentioned people as it did to Chen Guangcheng. Thank you.
Ms. Gang Ho, thank you so much for your testimony. And I think all of us will redouble our efforts. We've never ceased, people on this panel, members of the House and Senate. Certainly the administration has to do more because your husband, your tenacious appeal on his behalf has been stunning. And we thank you. I thank you on behalf of all of us for that. Mr. Gensler.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, Congressman Weber, Chairman Wolf as well. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the ongoing persecution of Chinese lawyers and their families in China. The work of this subcommittee highlighting the plight of individual victims of human rights abuses around the world is absolutely essential, and I want to begin by thanking all of you for your principled support for prisoners of conscience. Mr. Chairman, I am particularly pleased to be here with my friends Pastor Fu and T. Kumar and human rights heroes and champions Gung He and Chen Guangcheng. They, unfortunately, represent flip sides of the same coin. Gung He is here as the wife of an imprisoned Chinese rights lawyer, while Chen Guangcheng, himself a rights advocate and former prisoner of conscience, is now advocating on behalf of his own family and their ongoing persecution by Chinese authorities. As founder of Freedom Now, a legal advocacy organization that works to free prisoners of conscience around the world, and as international pro bono counsel to both Chen Guangcheng and Gung He, my testimony today will highlight briefly the ways that China's ongoing persecution of both the two of them and their family members violates international law. And more importantly, I'm actually going to focus my testimony today on what specifically the Obama administration can do and what more the Congress can do to try to bring an end to the suffering of these courageous people and their families. As you know, Gao Zhisheng is one of the most prominent rights lawyers in China. What he and Gung He have been through has been absolutely horrific. I'm not going to go into it in much detail. It's been described in a lot of detail here, but I want to highlight in particular the persecution that Gung He and her children have been through. After Gao Zhisheng was detained and disappeared and horrifically tortured and then released, his wife and children were persecuted extensively. And this included persecuting their then 10-year-old daughter, Grace, who was taken to school every day by 4 or 5 Chinese security officials who sat in her classroom every single day, who insulted her in front of the class, who followed her into the restroom and made her a Chinese security official, made a 10-year-old girl keep the door open to the bathroom while she went to the bathroom to humiliate her, and told people in the class that if any of them let her use their cell phone, that they could go to prison and there's nothing that the school or their families would be able to do for them. putting this kind of pressure on a 10-year-old girl as a way to get after her father is not only beyond the pale, it is horrific and inhumane in every sense of that word. And this is the reality of the Chinese Communists today, and this is the reality of the fear that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government has of their own population, particularly talented rights lawyers like Gao Zhisheng, who, despite losing most of his cases, tenaciously stood up for human rights victims and pressed incredibly hard for their rights to be secured. Chen Guangcheng's story is also well known, and what he has been through and what his wife and child have been through is also horrific. Living in rural China with no education to speak of, he began as a rights advocate, advocating initially on behalf of local people with disabilities who were being taxed in violation of Chinese law. He then moved on, as has been discussed extensively here, to advocating for women who were victimized by China's one-child policy through forced abortion and sterilization. And by exposing the horrors of the one-child system and how it was implemented in China, he himself became a target and has become a hero to the international community and to anyone in China who knows what he has done to try to stop the ongoing abuses of the one-child system. But the fact that since he escaped to the U.S. Embassy and in the Chinese government's view embarrassed them, that they then came into his family compound where many of his family members live. This was not, to be very clear, this was not the police. This was government-sponsored thugs and local party officials who came into their home, destroyed everything in front of them, looted and stole things, beat up most of the people there, initially took away his brother, who was only returned 24 hours later after being tortured, and then came and arrested and came close to killing his nephew, Chen Guangcheng, who reacted by grabbing a knife for only the prospect of self-defense. When you have 5 government-sponsored thugs in your house, on your property, and several of them are yelling, "Kill him, kill him," under those circumstances, what can anybody do? What can anybody do? I'm a human rights lawyer. I believe in nonviolence. But under those circumstances, when you have people yelling to kill you and they're in your own home, I don't know what else anyone can do but pick up a knife and try to save their own lives. And he didn't even injure people in any serious manner. Nobody was even hospitalized. One guy had a scratch. But I mean, at the end of the day, this was clearly self-defense. And of course, they wouldn't have even shown up at the family compound, but for the fact that 48 hours earlier, Chen Guangcheng had courageously and extraordinarily escaped from his home to Beijing. It is an amazing, amazing story. But the striking feature of these cases is that they demonstrate how the Chinese authorities act with impunity, violating the fundamental rights of their citizens. As a country of 1.2 billion people, and a government that's one of the most powerful governments on earth, how can a government that's so powerful feel so weak and so afraid that they are afraid of people like Chen Guangcheng and Gao Zhisheng? And what they need to do is they need to come down on them with the full weight of the state, not only on them as rights advocates, but on the backs of their families to crush them. How can a government that claims to be so powerful be, in fact, so weak? And even worse, when human rights defenders seek help from competent legal counsel in a country that claims to abide by the rule of law, their own lawyers get targeted. Indeed, as long as the government is not held accountable for the continued detention and mistreatment of rights defenders and their families, we can only expect these violations to continue. When we consider the most important metric, the freedom of Gao Zhisheng and Chen Guangcheng, one can only conclude that the Obama administration's approach on Chinese human rights has not achieved the results that these families desperately deserve, and that its tactics have to change. This family is especially striking because of the special duty our country owes to both of them and their families, because they reside here in the United States, and they are here with the protection of the United States. In the absence of progress on these cases, it's my view that the Obama administration has to increase the pressure. For example, we requested that President Obama personally meet with Gung Ha and Chen Guangcheng during their visit to Washington. In my view, such a meeting would send a clear and unequivocal message that the continued targeting of rights lawyers and their families by Chinese authorities will no longer be tolerated by the international community. I was disappointed, frankly, to receive a response from the White House, which indicated to me that Instead of meeting at the White House, it was recommended that we go to the State Department and meet with officials at the State Department. And my response to that reply from the White House was to say that I didn't consider it to be a serious response. And the reason I don't consider it to be a serious response is, to their credit, the State Department has been pressing in a range of ways on both of the cases of Chen Guangcheng and his nephew, as well as on Gao Zhisheng's case. Indeed, Secretary Clinton raised Gao Zhisheng's case publicly, calling for his release. Former Assistant Secretary Mike Posner was relentless on Gao Zhisheng's case. Obviously, the State Department was able to negotiate Chen Guangcheng's release, to its credit, ultimately. But at the end of the day, it is quite clear and very apparent and very sad to say that without executive leadership from the President of the United States, I fear that people like Chen Guangcheng and Gung He and their families will not obtain the relief that they so desperately need. I wish I could say that this was the only time I've been disappointed with the White House, but unfortunately, I've had similar experiences on other cases. I serve as international counsel to Liu Xiaobo, who won the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize. His wife, Liu Xia, has been under house arrest for more than 2 years, since a week after Liu Xiaobo won the Nobel Peace Prize. This past December, we initiated a major action on their behalf. We had 134 Nobel laureates across all 6 disciplines, reaching out to Xi Jinping, the incoming Chinese president at the time. This was this past December 4th, and saying to Xi Jinping, you need to understand, we, these 134 Nobel laureates across all 6 disciplines, the one commonality between us all, we've all achieved extraordinary things in different fields, but the one commonality among us all is that without freedom of expression, without freedom of association, without the creativity that a free society provides us, we could not have achieved what we have achieved in our respective careers. And we consider Liu Xiaobo one of us. We asked President Obama to sign on to that letter. As you'll recall, he won the Nobel Peace Prize himself. And unfortunately, we never received a response from the White House to that request. And the request that we had to the White House to speak out publicly against Liu Xia's ongoing house arrest has never been responded to as well. At the end of the day, ultimately, without executive leadership, I do not think that the Chinese will take our concerns about Chinese human rights seriously. I understand we have many important issues with the Chinese government. I understand that there are huge economic issues, social issues, cultural issues, intellectual property, Iran, North Korea. I could go on with a long list of concerns. But it seems to me that even during the Soviet Union and the Helsinki process, we were able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We were able to talk about nuclear issues, economic issues, human rights issues, and we were able to engage in all of those discussions simultaneously with the Soviet Union. And it seems to me that that's precisely what we need to do with respect to the People's Republic of China. And until we act consistently and unequivocally and repeatedly and publicly to make clear our concerns about Chinese human rights, we will not get the results that we want. The last thing that I'll note is that one of the other ways that we could be more creative would be by working multilaterally, something that we haven't seen, working on Chinese human rights issues, at least up front and publicly we haven't seen it. As an illustration, Baroness Ashton of the European Union is going to China at the end of this month to discuss a whole range of issues. We've never seen any public statements from President Obama and Baroness Ashton, or President Obama and Francois Hollande, the French president, and David Cameron, the British prime minister, publicly saying to the Chinese government, release Liu Xiaobo, release Liu Xia, release Gao Zhisheng, release Chen Guangcheng. It seems to me that at a minimum, we should at least be able to privately engage in those conversations with the Chinese government and say, if we do not start to see the progress that we need, we are going to have no choice but to speak publicly about these issues. At least we can privately say that to the Chinese. But sadly, I have not seen an indication or a willingness of the White House to be willing to even take those private actions. So in conclusion, it's my view that until a clear, unequivocal, and consistent message on human rights is delivered to the Chinese government with benchmarks, timelines, and consequences for inaction, we should not expect its behavior to change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kessler. Excellent comments, and look forward to asking some questions. Mr. T. Kumar.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman Smith. First of all, I would like the committee to insert our statement.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Amnesty International is extremely pleased to testify here. And we would like to recognize your leadership, Congressman Smith, over the years on a number of countries, not only in China. And today, one of your activism produced results, and we are seeing Chen here. We strongly believe that the hearing you had here, where we also testified, his testimony from the hospital bed changed the tide. You know, Secretary Clinton was in China. It was not sure whether US will take the leadership in asking for his release and bringing him here over to US. And the hearing you had made a difference. So thank you, Congressman Smith. We also like to express our appreciation to Congresswoman Bass, and Amnesty International is looking forward to working with you. And thank you for inviting us to testify. We can't conclude this hearing without bipartisanship. We can't have an active human rights legislation or even pressure without having bipartisan leadership. And we are glad to see it's working out here. Before I go into detail, I would like to summarize Amnesty International's research over the years and what the current situation in China is. First of all, there is a system called re-education through labor camps, under which tens of thousands of Chinese citizens have been imprisoned without charge or trial, simply at the whim of local police officers. That particular system is encouraging police officers and the government officials to silence critics and also Falun Gong practitioners and others. So Amnesty International is campaigning to ensure that that system is abolished. And we want Congress to take the leadership as well, because they have not gone through any fair trial before they have been imprisoned. They were just imprisoned without charge or trial. And the labor conditions are extremely sad. 16 hours a day they have to work, forced labor. Second, related to Chen, is the treatment of human rights defenders and lawyers. These are the human rights defenders who get abused purely because they are standing up for others' rights. In this case, more or less, it's for one-child policy and to trying to bring justice to the victims. It's not only the human rights defenders have been abused, their families have been targeted, which we heard here. So it's a practice that Chinese have been taking on and going after not only human rights defenders, but also the families. Third is the death penalty. China executes more people than the rest of the world combined after unfair trials. As you are aware, Congressman, we oppose death penalty everywhere, including in this country. So we are having a major campaign again around the world to abolish death penalty, because more so, it's the victims are poor and marginalized communities. And then the other issue is the one-child policy. Abuses committed in the name of one-child policy. We have documented that women have been forcibly aborted and forcibly sterilized purely because to maintain that one-child policy quota, even though the Chinese government have instructions, allegedly instructions, to say that you should not forcibly abort or sterilize women. That practice is going on. We have never seen even one prosecution or one punishment of a government official who was involved in forced abortion and sterilization. That's a challenge everyone can put to Chinese, that if you're serious about stopping abuse, prosecute people who have been involved in these practices, which Amnesty International have documented years after years of forced abortion and sterilization. Then there is torture. People have died in prisons in hundreds, mostly Falun Gong, as well as Tibetans and Uyghurs, Muslim Uyghurs from Xinjiang. And finally, the plight of religious minorities there, or religion per se. Any religion that's not being recognized by the government, and any followers have been abused, detained, and tortured. Catholic Church members who have connections to Vatican have been singled out and abused. Then we have Tibetans, which we have seen years and years. Now the situation has come to such an end. Over 100 people have burned themselves, self-immolated them out of desperation. What Chinese government is doing is trying to contain the demonstrations coming out rather than addressing the root causes of what the grievances are there in Tibet. Then we have Uyghurs. Uyghur Muslims, they were singled out again. They have been called terrorists because, unfortunately, they practice a faith called Islam. Hundreds have been detained. Even Rabia Qadhi's son is still in prison there. The only mistake he did was to born as a son of Rabia Qadhi. So what can we do? Human rights organizations can report, campaign, lobby. But in the US, there are two branches that can be very active. One is the Congress, which we believe you are doing the right thing, including this hearing. Then the other one is the administration. There is a golden opportunity for the administration that's going to come less than a week now. Secretary Kerry is going to visit China this weekend. This is his first visit as a Secretary of State. He should make sure that he set the right tone about human rights while he is there. He should speak up. He should mention to Chinese leaders, both privately and publicly, that they should abide by the international standards. It's not the United States standards, Chairman. It is the international standards that US should advocate. Failure to do that will send a wrong message to the Chinese leaders that United States, and in extension, the international community, is not concerned about the way Chinese government treats its own citizens. US, as one of the 5 members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, have a special responsibility. US also, and also China is a permanent member of the Security Council. US is a member of the Human Rights Council, UN. China is a UN member of the Human Rights Council. So the US have all the right to speak up and to put markers there. We hope Secretary Kerry will not lose this golden opportunity by speaking up. When he speaks up in China, he's not only speaking up to the leaders of China, he's speaking to the people of China. Human rights, by the end of the day, it is about the people's rights. The only thing that Secretary Kerry we are asking is to champion the rights of the people of China. One thing that we want to point out is that if Secretary Kerry fails to speak up in a meaningful manner, he will lose all his moral credibility to speak about human rights in any other countries. So he should, and we expect him to speak up. We will know in a week's time whether he is up to that task. And he's a Secretary of State who can rise up to the occasion and speak about human rights abuse, not only against the weak countries and poor countries, but also to the powerful countries. In conclusion, Amnesty International, thank you again for holding this hearing. And we believe these hearings will have enormous impact in affecting U.S. foreign policy, and also send a strong message to countries around the world that U.S. value is also human rights. Thank you very much for inviting.
Mr. Kumar, thank you very much for those very strong words, and certainly since you have been here on so many other countries, your consistency is greatly appreciated. So thank you so much for that. I'd like just to ask a few questions and yield to my colleagues. I want to assure Mr. Chen that we will follow up on your request to get all relevant data and documents concerning your situation as it was in China. And we'll ask the Government Accountability Committee to do likewise, but also the Foreign Affairs Committee. So thank you for that recommendation, or that request. Let me just very briefly, and I do again hope the press takes very keen note of this. Back in 1984, I offered the First Amendment conditioning United States contributions to organizations as to whether or not, if they were involved with forced abortion or forced sterilization, they would be precluded such funds. That morphed into what became known as the Kempt-Kasten language, which is the current law of the land. Earlier in this hearing, one of my colleagues mentioned that UNFPA had had an unblemished record. I think that the documentation couldn't be more clear that we have aided and abetted by aiding and abetting an organization that is on the ground implementing Chinese law, which is a one-child per couple policy, which relies on what they euphemistically call social compensation fees, huge, ruinous fines, up to 10 times both husband and wife's salaries. No one can pay them, or bribes, or having a child on the run, which some women are able to do. The Financial Times did a report on March 15th, pointing out that there have been more abortions, and most of those are forced, in China than there are people in the United States of America. 330 million. Mr. Chen mentioned a moment ago about the 130,000 forced abortions in his small area. And your list, which you lifted up and held for our look, which will be made a part of the record, we will send to the administration and ask them to enforce the law. We have a law, I wrote it in the year 2000, that says anyone who is complicit in forcing a woman to abort her child, or a man or woman to undergo a sterilization, is made inadmissible into the United States of America. You cannot get a visa. We asked the Congressional Research Service to look into it to see how many times it has been implemented. It is less than 30. So, Mr. Chen, your list becomes, I think, a blueprint for action, an engraved invitation for the administration to look at those individuals and bar entry into the United States of anyone who has committed such violence against women and children pursuant to the law. Just enforce United States law. It's on the books. I know because I wrote it. So I would hope that that would be the case. So I look forward to following up with your list, Mr. Chen, to see if the administration will do that. Let me ask just a couple of things. Mr. Genser, you mentioned that we basically risked superpower confrontation with the Soviet Union by ensuring, and you, Mr. Kumar, said it as well, that human rights were central, a main central pillar of U.S. foreign policy. All of us were greatly chagrined when Hillary Clinton said en route, first trip to Beijing, I'm not going to let human rights, quote, interfere with global climate change and other issues. So long as it is put askance or aside and compartmentalized, human rights will not be seen by the Chinese government as being something we absolutely cherish and will fight to the end for. I would respectfully submit we would be working much closer with the Chinese on North Korea had we insisted, as you pointed out, clear, consistent, unequivocal support for human rights, Mr. Genser. We would have a greater partner in standing up to the tyranny of the new leader, the new leader in Pyongyang. So human rights pay dividends in far more ways than just helping great individuals like Gao Zhisheng and Chen Guangcheng and the others who have suffered so much for freedom and human rights. It has great positives in other areas as well. So I just, not really a question, but we will follow up on all of these things as you have recommended. Try anew with the administration. Hope springs eternal. My hope is that they will grab this and run with it. It is in the interests of the suffering people of China, but it's also in global interests, because we've seen in Africa and elsewhere, because this is the Africa Global Human Rights Committee, global human rights obviously applying to China and everywhere else, but we've seen that the bad governance model of China is being exported as well. People like Bashir in Sudan love the Chinese model of dictatorship and secret police. You don't have to worry about the messy details of democracy and checks and balances. So I'd like to yield to Ms. Bass, if you'd like to comment on any of that, any of our distinguished witnesses, or I'll yield for some other questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I do have some questions, but before I get there, though, I feel I must follow up in terms of the testimony that was given by my colleague, Congressman Barra, because I believe what he was referring to was, first of all, I think he very strongly articulated that he was opposed to China's one-child policy and was opposed to forced abortions under anybody's policy. But that he was talking about support for the United Nations Population Fund, and he was making a distinction by saying that no government should intrude in the right of a woman to control her own body. So I just want to state for the record that that's what he was referring to.
Lady would yield.
Sure.
Just very briefly, but there have been findings repeatedly, and probably the most comprehensive one was done by Secretary Negroponte back in 2008. And pursuant to ChemCaston, which very simply says that no funds to any organization that supports or co-manages a coercive population control program, that it couldn't have been more clear in their finding that the UN Population Fund had so violated U.S. law and then therefore was ineligible for U.S. funding. Because the UNFPA, at the end of the day, enforces, is integral, because they do also provide training, to the one-child per couple policy, and it relies, that policy, on coercion to achieve its ends.
Okay, I again just want to state that I do believe that my good colleague, who's a new member of the House, was not in support of that policy, and I believe he made that very clear. Moving on, though, I did want to ask a few questions of Mr. Genser. You know, you were talking about what the administration should do in terms of being more forceful. And I'm also a relatively new member of Congress. I'm in my second term, and I was wondering if maybe you could talk about some past administrations in regard to China and what they might have done. And so twofold, I'm asking about past U.S. administrations, but I think you also referenced several other countries. And so if you look at other major international powers, what have they done in regard to taking on China and its policies?
Sure. Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bass, for the question. I think it is an important one. Let me respond to the two parts in turn. The first is I've been at this as a human rights lawyer for about a dozen years in Washington. For me, not surprisingly, this is not a partisan question. This is a human rights question. And what I try to do is just speak to it as I see it, as any administration goes, and as any Republican or Democrat goes on human rights questions. So there are champions on human rights in the House that are, of course, Democrats and Republicans.
And I'm sorry, just not human rights in general. I'm referring specifically to China's policies that we're discussing today.
Yeah, no, understood. Look, I think that all administrations, all White Houses, in my experience, and it only goes back a couple of White Houses, have some hesitance in advocating for human rights. But I can speak based on personal experience, particularly to the George W. Bush administration, the difference in approach between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. I represented for 5 years an imprisoned Chinese dissident, Yang Zhanli. He was in prison for 5 years. His wife and kids were American citizens, so it became a very high-profile case here in the Congress. We had, at one point, 112 members on Congress going on one letter to George W. Bush asking him to raise the case to Chinese President Hu Jintao. He did that, and it was announced publicly that he had done that. And ultimately, although it took a lot of work and a lot of time, Yang Zhenli was released from prison and is now back here in the United States with his family. You know, I think that the optics from where I sit are just different between different administrations. I think that George W. Bush very much enjoyed meeting with dissidents and having their views heard and speaking publicly about what he experienced. Unfortunately, I haven't seen President Obama take the same approach. He has, as far as I can tell, and as far as I've observed over the last 5 years, one meeting over the course of the last 5 years with about a dozen dissidents at one time, on one occasion. And it seems to me that whenever the president travels abroad, particularly when he's engaging with countries that are not allies of the United States in every sense of that term, that it's very important to send the view to the world that he understands and is concerned about the suffering of people in that country, even though the U.S. has very different kinds of interests associated with that country. So I don't fault the president personally for saying, you know, we have a lot of interest with China and we need to be careful where we tread. But I do agree with Chairman Smith and with those who would say that we need to be consistent and coherent and deliver the message from all quarters of the administration that China human rights matter and are important. And so what I would say is, you know, this administration's record, in my view, is not as strong as the prior administration on raising China human rights matters. And I don't think it's too late to change that.
Sure, sure.
And there's a lot more that can be done.
Because I want to move on. Could you comment about other major powers, what you see them doing?
Sure. Well, I think that there are mixed messages, I think, from other major powers. I mean, I think that, you know, we'll see what Baroness Ashton does at the end of the month, but the EU has spoken up publicly about Liu Xiaobo and Liu Xiao's case, in my experience, much more than the United States has, as the European Union. And individual member states of the EU, particularly the United Kingdom, have been outspoken publicly. I'm not following every country in the world simultaneously, of course, so I can't speak to a lot of the details, but I would just say that, you know, everybody can do more. And so my criticism is not lodged exclusively at the United States. It's saying if we want human rights to actually matter and we want the Chinese government to view human rights as something that is actually a concern of ours, if we don't deliver that message consistently, we're not going to get the results that we want.
Thank you. I think this question, I'm sorry, go right ahead, Mr. Kumar.
If I comment on that issue. Amnesty International believes that the U.S. government should incorporate human rights in all its activities, all its interactions with Chinese government. For example, they have dialogue with the Commerce Department, Defense Department.
They've dialogued with, I'm sorry?
Defense, Commerce, U.S. Everyone should have a brief on human rights. It's not only the Human Rights Bureau at the State Department that should talk about human rights. Unless it cuts across every department, they are not going to take it seriously. They know that this is kind of a, for the sake of doing, U.S. is doing. And there is also another issue. There are two dialogues that U.S. is having with China. One is U.S.-China human rights dialogue. Every year they talk. The other one is U.S.-China economic and security dialogue. We are urging U.S. government for years to make sure, don't single out human rights, just incorporate that human rights into economic and security dialogue. So it should be called economic, security, and human rights dialogue. Then only they will get the message. They are not going to get the message, it's only human rights dialogue. So a lot of things US can do without getting permission from China, without getting any concern about China. Only from this end they can do, which they are not doing. And go ahead.
No, finish your comment.
And the issue of major powers, it's a reality. US is the only superpower. And it is a reality that only country that can meaningfully pressure China is US. There may be a group of countries like European Union, if they can ever put their act together and come with a strong message. So US have a special responsibility when it comes to China. It may not be a special responsibility to some other countries, where other countries can take on. But when it comes to China, US should take the leadership along with other countries. Again, it's not lecturing China. It's about urging China to ensure, to respect the internationally recognized human rights norms and practices.
Thank you. You know, I know a reference had been made to Secretary Clinton's trip over to China, and I think in her tenure as Secretary of State, she was certainly known for her leadership on women's rights around the world. And I certainly recall numerous times when she pointed out the abuses in China. But moving on, I wanted to ask a couple of other questions. I believe Mr. Chen had made reference to the re-education through labor system. And I know that there have been some proposed reforms to that system, and I just wanted to know if you, I believe it was you that was referencing that, and I wanted to know if you thought the reforms had done anything at all. I mean, the fact that the labor camps exist, I don't really know how you reform them. It seems like they would need to be eliminated, but the Chinese government have talked about proposed reforms. What reforms were those supposed to be? Who was it? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was Pastor Fu that had made reference.
Thank you. The re-education through labor system is really the most extrajudicial evil law in the land of China. And Chinese government basically using that practice to primarily targeting those so-called soft crimes, means political dissidents, the members of the underground church, the Falun Gong practitioners, and of course other democracy activists. So over the years, basically that the Chinese security chief can have that authority basically to make you lose freedom up to 4 years without going through any judicial review, without going through any other branches of the, like the court or prosecutors review. And of course, you know, there is a mechanism. They said you can continue to appeal. Rarely you can win any of these cases. Basically, that's many people were sent to these labor camps and forced to work, sometimes up to 18 hours a day in these labor camps. As you mentioned, that the Chinese government from this year, ironically, the Minister of Public Security, the former minister was Mr. Meng Jianzhu, made that announcement this year, in the beginning of this year, by saying China actually will stop the re-education through labor system. But then the Chinese official news reports actually corrected him by saying the Chinese government is seriously considering to reform the re-education.
So they made him retract his statement?
Yes, yes. And of course, there are a few provinces made the announcement by a few the provincial security heads. I believe including Guizhou, make that public that they will suspend the practice, which means they will not using that system to send to imply to the other to those people subject for re-education through labor. And of course, you know, I'm very, very hopeful because this evil practice has been so long and offended so many innocent people and has been make so many families suffering so much. I think the whole China, even those Communist Party affiliate scholars and numerous legal scholars, even some members of the People's Congress in the Judicial Committee publicly advocate for abolition of this system. And I hope, this will happen in reality. And I also hope the Communist Party, all the People's Congress, by finally suspending or abolishing this system, would not find another system to substitute for their extrajudicial activities for targeting those people. So, thank you.
And then final question to Mr. Chen. I wanted to know what your plans are when you return to China. How do you expect to be treated, and how is your family doing?
我想现在我倒没有考虑这个问题，我只想现在呢，在美国能够同时不断地推动中国的人权进步。
I have not thought about that too much. And now in the U.S., I just want to continue to push on the human rights in China.
刚才我听到关于劳教的问题，我要补充一点，就是说，即使现在中共停止执行劳教制度，也并不等于公民权利就有了进步，因为他们在停止劳教制度之前，已经在刑事诉讼法里边加了一个73条，这个73条赋予他们的这个打手们可以把公民随意抓走，半年之内不通知律师、不通知家属，所以他们有了这一条的帮助，那么他们更容易的比劳教还容易的来迫害民众。
I just want to add that add on the re-education through labor camp. Before they actually added a clause to the law that they could actually beat the people and then force them. They could make the person disappear without notifying their relatives for 6 months.
It says that in the law?
That's in the law.
对，这是法律，是今年1月1号开始的。
It starts from January 1st this year.
Okay, thank you.
谢谢。
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each one of you for your testimony. And I wanted to follow up. Most of what it sounds like today is that we just need to continue to highlight this particular issue. I've been following it for some 20 years and find it amazing that some of the testimony that's been given today is just very disturbing, and even with someone who's been following it closely for that length of time. And yet at the same time, highlighting the issue seems like that is what we need to continue to do. The chairman of this very committee brought this issue up with the General Secretary of the UN, and I was somewhat concerned in his facial and his response to act like he didn't even know about these atrocities that are going on, and so I want to commend the chairman for bringing that up in that environment. But Mr. Kumar, let me start with you, if I might. In your testimony, you mentioned the importance of having Secretary Kerry remember his audience, I think is in your written testimony that you talked about when he travels to China, and that the audience is not just the Chinese government, but the people of China. What, in light of social media and some of the other things that get out, what do references to human rights violations and democracy, do they garner any special attention among the Chinese people?
Yeah, there are, even though there are so many restrictions being placed. For example, even in text messages, human rights and democracy cannot be text. That's what we heard. So there are ways people are getting. But Secretary Kerry speaking out is totally different from average Chinese citizens getting information about human rights from human rights organizations or others. Secretary Kerry's first trip, and during his first trip, if he fails to speak up in a meaningful manner, then Chinese people will feel that U.S. as a country, I'm very careful to say that U.S. should not lecture. They should only insist on international standards.
So am I hearing you? Let me interrupt for just a second. So what you're saying is the most important thing that Secretary Kerry could do on his trip coming up in just a few days is to highlight this particular issue diplomatically, but make sure that they know the importance that he and this administration places on human rights violations.
Yes, but he has to send a message to the leaders as well as to the people of China is that U.S. considers economic relationship and human rights and security and environment at the same level.
All right, so what you're saying is tying the economic and the human rights together. For example, we have a manufacturing plant here in the United States. We wouldn't tolerate these kinds of human rights violations within our own borders, so how dare we import other economic goods from China when we're tolerating it there? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what exactly I'm trying to say.
All right, and so what do you think are the hopes, and I would give this to you, Mr. Kumar, and then Mr. Jinser as well. What do you think the hopes that that clear kind of message will be articulated in the coming days?
The host will accept because they expect U.S. to speak up. And one example that we have seen U.S. leadership that provided results is Mr. Chen. If not for U.S. leadership, Chen will not be here. U.S. leadership came, to my opinion, if not for the special hearing that was held here when Mr. Chen was testifying from his hospital bed.
So is it your opinion that the other two that we've highlighted today in terms of the testimony that are held in prison, that their release is only dictated by the leadership of this particular government speaking out on that behalf, and that if they don't speak out, those folks will not be released?
U.S. should take the leadership. Other countries should join, but U.S. should take the leadership. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, U.S. is the only superpower left. So U.S. Superpower should also have responsibilities in terms of speaking out. Not speaking out will send the extremely wrong message to the leadership and to the people at large.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar and Mr. Jinser.
Sure. Well, let me just make two brief comments in response to your question. My first public recommendation to Secretary Kerry, which he could do privately when he goes in several days, is he could privately bring a copy of the op-ed that Chen Guangcheng and Gao Zhisheng had in the Washington Post, asking for a meeting with the president. And he could say to the Chinese leaders, help us, help you, right? We don't want to have this meeting between Chen Guangcheng and Gao Zhisheng, but we're under a lot of pressure here in Washington. There was a hearing on Capitol Hill. There was an op-ed in the newspaper. We need to see some progress on these cases. We've mentioned these cases publicly and privately over many, many years, and we haven't seen progress, and people are getting impatient. So we want to give you a private opportunity to get that done. Now, that's something he could do very concretely in the next several days, that I think if he were to deliver that message, we would start to see some movement on these cases. And then the second and last thing that I would just say is that it is also very, very important from where I sit to not just talk about human rights at 100,000 feet and talk about the need for advancing the rule of law. This is what the Chinese love to do. They love to come to these bilateral human rights dialogues, and they love to sit there in those rooms. And in essence, what we have is sequential monologues with both sides talking past each other. And the Chinese issue a press release and say, this was a wonderful dialogue that we engaged in. And it's the dialogue itself which is the outcome. But from where I sit, that's not the outcome. The outcome is, are we seeing progress in a bunch of ways? And yes, of course, progress can come by changing laws in ways that are compatible with international law. And I'm not trying to discount the importance of it. But I think we always need to be focusing on, like we have today, a handful of actual live people's cases and people's lives, where you can have a clear and unequivocal benchmark with large photographs of people. And are they or are they not still in prison? And if they are, the tactics that we are deploying, by definition, have failed, and we need to think about new tactics.
Do you think that there is a clear understanding with the Chinese government that we're not asking them to abide by U.S. law, but just by UN guidelines? Do you think there's a clear understanding of that?
I think the problem is that the Chinese receive different messages from different actors in the United States. And the messages from within the administration, from the State Department and the White House, aren't the same. The messages from the Hill are different depending on who you talk to. And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of people in China and the Chinese government think that human rights is somehow a sword to use to get political advantage and not something that's consistent with our values. And the only way that they're going to perceive it differently, to be clear, I'm not justifying that perception, because I do think it is fundamental to our core values, to our Constitution, to our Declaration of Independence. But I do think that the only way that we combat that perception is, as Kumar was saying, by consistently raising it to the Chinese government across all the different aspects of the relationship. And it's only when we do that consistently across the executive branch and the legislative branch that the Chinese will understand that we take it seriously. But if we're going to start censoring ourselves and be afraid of raising human rights to the Chinese for fear that they might, not give us what we need on other important issues, then if I were them, I probably also wouldn't take all that seriously, our concerns about human rights.
All right, Mr. Chairman, do I have time for 2 more questions? Okay. Well, let me go on a little bit further with that, because it's all about the message. And as I think has been pointed out, you made pretty straightforward actions that the Obama administration could take in order to promote human rights in China, including a meeting between the president and the distinguished guest that we have here today. Can you explain the reluctance that the White House has in why this meeting has not taken place, given the kind of visibility that we have with Mr. Chen here today and Pastor Fu and et cetera?
Obviously, I work as pro bono lawyers for the 2 distinguished guests here, so I can't answer for the White House. I will say there's a genuine reluctance on most White House's parts to be viewed as doing things that are provocative to important partners of ours on multiple issues. But again, I think that they're not looking at it the right way. I think that they need to look at the fundamental values that are important to us as a country, to have a true north, which is grounded in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, and to implement policy on the basis of our fundamental values. And that means that at times we're going to have to do the thing that isn't politically expedient, but that's consistent with our values, which is speaking up for human rights. If it's only about what's politically expedient, human rights is almost never going to be a priority for this country.
Well, do you believe, and I would ask this of Mr. Kumar as well, do you believe if the American people as a whole knew the kind of atrocities that have been highlighted here in this hearing, plus others that have not been covered, do you think that they would see that and have an economic revolt? As Mr. Kumar said, they have to be tied together. Do you see that the American people would speak up?
I do think so. Louis Brandeis said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think that, sadly, for most Americans, there isn't much attention paid to what's happening 10,000 miles away, whether it be China human rights or what's going on in Darfur or a whole long list of this, the situation in Syria. You could go through a long list of things that the average American isn't familiar with. I think that these issues are so extraordinary, and the persecution of these 2 individuals and their families is so beyond the pale. And if the United States of America, as what I believe right now is the most powerful nation on earth, can't stand up for the most persecuted people in those countries, Liu Xiaobo, Liu Xia, Gao Zhisheng, Chen Guangcheng, if we can't stand up for those people who are most persecuted because we're afraid of our own interests on other matters with China, then who is going to stand up for these people? And I think that's really just the fundamental bottom line.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Kumar?
Yes, I agree. And I believe generally overall, U.S. citizens are aware of the situation purely because of Tiananmen Square massacre that took place about 20 years ago.
Right.
But we as an international human rights organization also have major campaigns. We have about 700,000 members in this country. We have hundreds of high school and college chapters. We also campaign on human rights issues, including human rights issues in China. So we believe the people of the U.S. get the message, and that's why we are confident that there will be change in the U.S. policy as well.
So last question, Mr. Chairman. If we have, one is communicating to the American people, the second part of that is getting this message out to the Chinese people that would know that. And there are reports that clearly indicate that China spends billions of dollars, truly billions of dollars, employing over 100,000 people to monitor and to really try to make sure that the internet is not a public place, and we see that. Would you think that the best peaceful means of trying to get that message out to the Chinese people would be to make a significant priority of circumventing those firewalls that are there to monitor on the internet?
Obviously, yes. That's why Congressman Smith introduced Global Online Freedom Act, which is to prevent U.S. corporations from helping countries around the world, including China, from using U.S. technology to block information flow and also monitor peaceful dissent within the country. So that is an essential aspect of freedom of expression, where any country should be allowed to do, and U.S. can push for that.
I mean, I would agree as well. I mean, I think that there are literally dozens of things that could be done to try to advance human rights in China if we had both the political will and the consistent commitment to actually make those things happen. And I think that it's really only a matter of our own imagination. One other issue that I'll mention as well is, you know, the 25th anniversary of Tiananmen Square is coming up June 4th of 2014. And I would love to see, you know, for example, a Congressional Gold Medal resolution introduced to honor, let's say, a half dozen Chinese dissident heroes, to be able to put pressure on the Chinese government to secure the freedom of these kinds of individuals and others, and to be able to have an event where the President of the United States and both houses of Congress would stand in solidarity with the Chinese people. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. That kind of a picture would be worth much more than that.
Well, my thank you.
好的。
Okay, Mr. Chen.
我想说呢，就是肯定会有很多中国的民众知道我们今天在这开听证会。
I'm sure that there are many Chinese netizens and Chinese people know that we are here for this hearing.
但是人数不一定足够多，那么原因就是网络柏林墙在起作用。
Probably not as many because of the Great Firewall in China.
那么美国7亿5千万用于信息透明的这个投资，现在用的只有1100多万，显然这跟中国在防止民众的这个信息自由上所投入的是不成比例的。
The amount of money that U.S. invested in information is disproportionate compared to how much the Chinese invest in forbidding its people from using the internet.
所以从长远的利益讲，我们在开发这个翻墙软件以及推倒网络柏林墙，才能够让中国人民真正的得到言论自由。
We need to invest and break down the Great Firewall so that the Chinese people can freely speak.
一旦这个中国人民有了说话的机会，我想信息流通自由了，再想欺骗民众就不可能了。
With the free flow of information, it would be harder and harder to deceive Chinese people.
Well, I want to thank each one of you for coming and for your boldness in testifying and illuminating this issue. And I thank Mr. Chairman for this very worthwhile hearing, and I yield back.
Mr. Meadows, thank you for your incisive questioning and commentary. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier in the remarks, figures were quoted that there was 330 million forced abortions, and there was 130,000, I think, abortions in Mr. Chen's area. And I don't remember who made those remarks. The chairman did? I said. Gotcha. What's the time period? Since 1979?
No, 2000. Oh, you mean the first number, the 330 million?
Right.
Yeah, that was since 1979 when the one-child policy was carried out.
Okay.
And the number for 130,000 cases that was documented by Mr. Chen. That happened only within like 6 months period of time in his city alone.
So it's interesting to me that thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amidst the discussion of human rights violations, that a major plank in our discussion is the taking of innocent human life, that would be unborn babies. So would you all agree that part of your reason for being here is to stop those atrocities, and that we would include those as a basic human right as well? Would you all agree with that?
Absolutely, and I would like Mr. Chen to also answer that question too.
我想这种强迫的肯定是一种人权问题啊。
Forced abortion is definitely a human rights issue.
对呀，没有一个母亲愿意把自己的孩子杀掉的。
No mothers want to kill their own children.
对。而且这个都是在中共党委的这个直接指使下，中共党委在中国是凌驾于宪法和法律之上的一个组织，而这个组织享有和皇帝一样的特权，他却不承担任何法律责任，因为在中国的法律上就不允许把中国共产党的任何一个党委列为被告。
It's definitely dictated by the Central Communist Party because the Communist Party is above the law, so nobody can sue the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, thank you. The point I'm driving to, of course, is that it's a basic human right. Life is a basic human right. We've had a lot of discussion here today about our country and the values that we have, and I'm glad to hear you all including that in your discussion today. And it doesn't matter whether the government forces the taking of that innocent human life, or in my opinion, whether the mother takes that innocent human life. The outcome is that an innocent human life is taken. And so I'm glad that we've made that distinction. Pastor Fu, you mentioned in your discussions that the U.S. Embassy can request permits to meet with those prisoners of conscience. And is there a list of the prisoners of conscience?
Yes, the U.S. I think even the Congressional Executive Committee Commission on China, CECC, has a very comprehensive list. And of course, for specific cases that those family members, and if any of the member of Congress, if any of the cabinet or administration officials who want to visit China or visit these family members when they are in China, we'd be glad to facilitate, we'd be glad to provide the most accurate information in terms of location, names, contact information. I think this should be part of the systematic and persistent effort and all-out effort, not only by congressional leaders, but also by all levels of the bilateral exchanges with China. And for instance, Mr. Zhu Yufu, the prisoner I just mentioned, who is dying in his prison, we have his prison address. We also have his wife's phone number. We have her next visit to Mr. Zhu is the April 13th. And
how many prisoners of conscience would you say that list entails? Is it 1,000, 10,000?
It's thousands, yeah, thousands of names.
Thousands.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's probably too much to ask that Secretary of State John Kerry would even entertain that idea. Have you all made that request to the State Department?
My organization, we have not made that request yet. I just...
okay.
Yeah.
Let me jump over to Mr. Kumar. Have you all made that a request of the State Department?
We urged Secretary Kerry to meet with some human rights, families of the human rights defenders. But he's going to be there only for a day, less than a day, actually.
Did you get a response from him?
Not yet.
How long ago was that request?
We had a meeting about a week ago, and we verbally asked.
Oh, okay. And Mr. Kumar, you also talked about Secretary John Kerry putting some pressure on him, and then I was glad to hear my colleague Mark Meadows' comments about social media and trying to build that awareness. Of course, I'm aware of I guess what we could now call the Great Firewall of China, no longer the Great Wall, but the Great Firewall of China. how they're intending to keep out all of the internet, as much social media as they can. Do radio signals, for example, from South Korea, do they reach into China, or do they block those?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I know Voice of America usually have live discussion at TV. I don't know whether they get interrupted or not.
Okay. Mr. Ginzer, you said that in your remarks, and I don't mean to end on a pessimistic note, but I believe you said we should, pretty much you ended with, we should not expect their behavior to change.
Well, I would echo what Chairman Smith said. I'm an eternal optimist about human nature and about what we can ultimately achieve if we put our minds to it. This actually isn't very complicated. It's actually quite simple. It's acting consistently with our values. So while on the one hand I would say that White Houses, past and present, tend to hedge when it comes to these kinds of issues, ultimately there's a lot that can be achieved, and the President has 3 more years in office, and we'll continue to urge him to move forward and to raise these issues, and we'll continue to be persistent about it.
Well, and that's what I want to encourage you to do, the public discourse and the public pressure. I didn't want you to be too discouraged, and I wanted you to continue that. Now, let me ask a question of you, since I've got you here at the mic. Why should China care what the U.S. says to them about human rights? Why should the Chinese government care?
Well, look, as an international human rights lawyer, what I would say is that China has signed major treaties that they want the United States to abide by. For example, acceding to the World Trade Organization and rules of trade. And international human rights law is equally binding on China as international trade law. At the end of the day, if they want to be a reliable partner for the United States, if they want to attract foreign investment, then foreign investors want to know that they can have certainty in their domestic court system if there is a dispute with
So are you saying that, as Mark Meadows kind of alluded to, that maybe we should have trade laws that keep Americans from investing in China when they have an abysmal record, especially when it comes to intellectual property rights?
Well, look, that's a sort of a more complex and longer discussion. But what I would say is that that it is important to hold China to account for their adherence to their international law obligations, and it's in China's interest, I believe, that the law be consistently applied, and they want it to be when it comes to their issues, and we're going to want it to be when it comes to ours. So, I don't think it actually behooves the Chinese government, for example, to have a court system that's not independent and impartial, because it makes foreign investors less interested in investing there. And if you have a court system that is independent and impartial, it can help not only businesses invest and be certain about outcomes, but also help human rights victims as well.
Pastor Fu, why should China care what we think?
I think, as I would echo my colleague, Attorney Jared Genser's saying, moreover, it is the values is the universal values, and if a government that ultimately disregard its own citizen basic dignity and rights, and how could they expect to be respected as a stakeholder?
I think you're getting to let me highlight that. A government that disregards the sanctity of life, I would call that a basic human right.
Yes.
The dignity of that person. Mm-hmm. What can we do to put pressure on them to recognize that and change? What's the answer here?
I agree with the recommendations. I think we have the nations, the President of the United States of America, and should speak and stand firmly, publicly, unequivocally, and persistently that the human rights issue is not Americans' concern, it's a universal concern.
Well, I wouldn't hold my breath for that to happen. But I think you're getting to the very crux of the matter, and I'm sorry we're getting a little short on time. I'd like to direct that same question.
And also the Chinese, and also specifically that, as I suggested, I think we have some concrete steps we recommend, for instance, for the U.S. Embassy, the ambassadors or consular general, they can make requests to meet with those victims of these prisoners and to visit the prison, even if they're not granted. I mean, that itself.
At least it brings it to bear, brings the light, the sunlight that Brandi talked about. So, and let's go to Mr. Chen, if I may, with the same question.
我想这样的问题，实际上我们应该这样想，并不是说中国迫害人权，我们提有没有用的问题，而是他们在做迫害人权的工作的时候，就有很多试探性的动作。在他做出试探性的动作，一方面在迫害人权，另一方面回过头来看看国际社会是不是真心关注。如果你真心关注的话，他就会适可而止；如果你是做做样子的话，他就会继续做下去。那么长期以来，他们这样做了以后，发现哦，这些国际民主国家的政府更看重的是钱，对人权问题可能很多时候只是做做样子给国民看。那么这样呢，他就可以无所顾忌的继续做下去。一方面在迫害人权，另一方面在向中国的民众说：你看，美国政府，这些民主国家的政府，表面上说关心人权，真正给他实际上真正关心的就是钱。
I think we shouldn't just ask whether or not it's useful to express our concerns to the Chinese government, because at one hand they do commit these human rights abuses, and they would turn around and look at how the international community reacts, and then if they see that the international community does not react, they would think that okay, they don't really care about human rights, they're just saying it, So we should definitely bring out this consistent message.
我可以举一个例子来说明这个问题。
I should give an example.
就拿中国的言论自由来讲，
In terms of freedom speech,
据我所了解，美国驻中国的记者只有100多个。
the American journalists in China is only a little bit over 100.
那也就是说，1000万中国民众要对待美国一个记者要对1000万人。
That means the ratio is 10 million Chinese citizens to one American journalist.
那么反过来讲，为中宣部服务的中国新华社的这些记者们，在美国加起来总共有800多。
And the Central Propaganda Department of China has about 800 journalists in the United States.
一个记者对30万人。
That's about one journalist to 30,000 U.S. citizens.
所以我们看到这个严重的不对等。那么他们可以在这个时代广场设立广告牌来宣传。那么我们有可能在天安门广场设立广告牌来宣传民主、法治、自由吗？这显然是不对等的。这样的工作，难道说我们民主国家的行政当局在国会真的就不能做吗？完全可以。
We see that there's an inequality. They could advertise in in the big TV screens in Times Square, but can we do that in Tiananmen Square? Certainly not.
对，所以说做正确的事情，不要担心独裁者生气。
So if we do the right thing, we should not be afraid that we will anger the dictators.
我相信我们如果有大量的投资在 这个推倒网络柏林墙上的话，中国的网络柏林墙不可能存在这么久。那么，中国一旦没有网络柏林墙，中国的民众他的思想、他的认识可能就不是这个样子了。这种独裁也不会持续这么久。
If we invest in breaking down the Great Firewall, we can certainly do it, and then the Chinese citizens will have this free flow of information, and the government can no longer deceive the people.
Okay, and one last question, if I may, Mr. Chairman, from Mr. Kumar, as from Amnesty International's viewpoint. Is our country the only one that is being called upon to pay attention and to make its voice heard?
I'm not saying U.S. is the only country. U.S. is the only superpower, so it has its own responsibilities.
All right, let me follow that up then by saying, does Amnesty International, do they reach out across the globe to other countries? Are there other organizations? Is there a fund mechanism so that people that care and get involved and want to make a difference and make their voice heard, is that going on?
Oh yeah, we are in existence from 1960 onwards. And we have about 3.2 million members around the world. And in about 85 countries, we have active activities like what I am doing here.
Okay.
We lobby, We urge different countries around the world, lot of Asian countries, if you are talking about China, Japan, Korea, Philippines, small countries like Nepal, everywhere, our members are campaigning for the rights of individuals around the world, including in China.
Great.
So we are a global movement. We are supposed to be, I am here, so that's why I am testifying about US foreign policy. My colleagues in Nepal will be testifying and calling upon Nepalese government to take on China about human rights abuses. But the reality is, US is the only superpower. So we have to recognize that.
All right, and last question, what's your website?
www.amnestyusa.org.
www.amnestyusa.org.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you, you bet.
Randy, thank you very much. Let me just ask a couple of final questions. Again, to Mr. Chen, if you could, with regards to your nephew, Chen Guangcheng, has the administration sought to visit him? Anybody within our embassy sought to go and visit him in prison?
肯定是没有。
I'm sure no. The answer is no.
With regards to other members of your family, has the U.S. Embassy been in touch with your brother, your mother, who's now 80, I believe, just celebrated her birthday? Has there been contact with other members of the family expressing concern, especially not just to them, but to the Chinese who would monitor such a meeting?
这个我没有听到，完全没有这方面的消息。从来没听说家人跟他们有接触。还有就是说，事实上对我家人的迫害一直没有停止。他们现在据我所知，每个组有16个人，究竟有几个组不详细，依然在私下里监视着我们的村庄。
In fact, I don't think that any people from the embassy visited them. I never heard anything about that. In fact, my family is still under persecution. They have several groups of people. I don't know how many groups are there, but each group consists of 16 people. They're constantly there, constantly persecuting my family members.
Are you in touch with them? Can you speak to them on the phone? Your family?
我跟他通过电话，但是很多时候，我们的电话是100%被监听的，因为有时候说过一些话以后呢，他们就马上就去找我的家人，只是威胁。因为我们村里有些人给我通过电话以后，他们就把我们的邻居这些村民强行带到派出所进行询问啊，你跟他通话都通了什么内容等等等，给他们施加威胁。
Yes, I have talked to them on the phone, but for sure the phone lines are monitored. And then, in fact, after my conversation with them, some of them were taken to the local police station and they were threatened. And then they were actually asking my relatives what was the content of the conversation that you guys had.
现在他在造谣，到处造谣，向民众煽动对我的仇视，而且说陈光诚在美国。 依然受到严密的监视，比在中国监视的还严重，在妖言惑众。
In fact, they also spread rumors to local authorities. They said that Chen Guangcheng in America is actually monitored more closely by the U.S. government than when he was in China.
Mr. Chen, a minute ago, Mr. Weber brought up a very good point about, how do we convince the Chinese? Why would they even listen to us? Would it be your thought that, and any of the distinguished witnesses, that while moral suasion and speaking out very clearly and unambiguously is important, it is also important that there be linkages to other things? And I'll give an example. We're doing a letter right now to Secretary Kerry asking that they properly find China to be what we call a Tier 3 country, an egregious violator of human trafficking. I wrote the law in 2000 called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We set up tiers. Tier 3 is the worst, and it carries with it a series of sanctions that could be imposed if the executive branch so wills it, in order to try to mitigate this horrible practice of modern-day slavery called human trafficking. As a direct result of the one-child per couple policy and the missing girls, we know that there are tens of millions of girls who have been slaughtered in the womb simply because they happen to be female. When allowed only one, it has put an unbelievable pressure on having just a male, and it has led to a gendercide of little girls. But now we're seeing the horrific consequences over time of men unable to find wives simply because they have been systematically eliminated through this one-child per couple policy and this gendercide consequence. China now has become probably the largest magnet for trafficking. We're seeing it not just the North Koreans who have been trafficked, and I've had several hearings on that, but we're seeing this rising problem. And it seems to me that this letter, which will be to Kerry very shortly, calls on China being named a Tier 3. In like manner, under Mr. Wolf's law, the International Religious Freedom Act, China has been designated a country of particular concern, or CPC country. And that carries with it 18 prescribed actions, the least of which would be a démarche, but all kinds of other sanctions that can be imposed. They're not draconian, but they are significant. And there has been no sanctioning of China, even though, as you pointed out, Pastor Fu, there is an actual plan to eliminate the house church movement over a 10-year period, and I believe it's over a 3-phased type of thing. I mean, I wasn't as aware of that until you laid it out in your testimony. They want to eliminate the house church movement. When Mr. Wolf and I went to China right before the Beijing Olympics, we sought to meet with several pastors. Every one of them, except one, was arrested before they could meet with us, and the one we did meet with was, after the fact, brought in, interrogated, and beaten by the Chinese secret police, simply for meeting with 2 members of Congress. And now you're talking about the new plan to eradicate the Christian church movement. It seems to me the administration has 2 right-at-hand ways of showing their extreme displeasure for trafficking, Tier 3 designation, which comes shortly, as well as CPC, which they already have, but now take the next step. I would agree, T. Kimura, you were in the trenches when we were fighting the battle to link most favored nation status with human rights. Bill Clinton linked them and did, I think, a very good linkage with what the human rights benchmarks had to be. Sadly, 1 year later, Friday at 6 o'clock or so in the afternoon, ripped up his own executive order, and that was when we lost China, I believe, or lost much of it in terms of human rights. They said profits trump human rights, according to the administration. So we do have 2 things at hand. If you might want to speak to that, any of you, because I think moral suasion is important, but I think we need to have some real tools and levers.
我觉得当然有很多可以做的啊，因为据我所知呢，前边我提到美国的记者在申请中国的签证的时候，他们会说哦，你们不需要这么多记者到中国来。可是如果他们800多对这100多，如果他们的申请签证也受到影响的话，我想情况可能不会这样。那么之所以发生这样的事情，那么咱们不做反应，他们久而久之呢，就不断的去进行这样的非对等的一些做法，特别是在人权问题上，当他们发现在人权问题，在美国政府当中是一个次要的议题的话，那么他们当然迫害起人权来就无所顾忌了。那如果他迫害了人权，在他很多工作上，在他国际空间上受到影响的话，让他不得不考虑，那么他们可能迫害的就会轻一点。就像我们现在如果我们提他的人权，他就会在伊朗问题、北朝鲜问题不合作呀。如果他们也有同样的担心的话，可能情况就好多了。
There's much we can do. For example, when the U.S. journalists apply for visa at the Chinese embassy, and then they may tell the U.S. journalists that we don't need American journalists there, and that we can actually do the same thing to Chinese journalists applying for visa to the United States. If we give them the impression that human rights is only a secondary issue, they will continue to, the human rights issue in China will continue to worsen.
Could I ask, is it Mr. Chen's belief that the Obama administration has made it a secondary issue? And Mr. Kumar, if you would speak to that, and Pastor Fu?
我觉得我的感觉是这样，至少效果是这样。我认为人权本身就是外交，它不能把它看成是外交的一部分，它本身就是外交。
This is how I feel, yes, in fact. But I think that human rights should not be just part of diplomacy. It should be diplomacy in itself.
Mr. Fu?
I think when we talk about the delink or linkage between the trade and human rights, it make me think, remind me about how the U.S. Transnational or U.S. large corporations, social and moral ethics and their social responsibilities. And I think if the Apple or the Google or especially these large corporations, if in China, if they operate in a way that just be compatible with the U.S., with the international human rights standard, I think the human rights in China would not come to this far, this worse in China. Just back to the end of last year, Mr. Chen and I, along with another American investor from New York City, we sent a letter to Mr. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, and requested a meeting to just brief him and ask him about how the factories in Apple enforce the one-child policy in their own factories to the women and men working there. And today, unfortunately, we have not heard a single response. And instead, we heard and we have seen after the CFO or COO of Apple went to China to apologize to the Chinese consumers. And at the same time, or the same day, in Apple's application, there is a classic literatures library, and several, or not several, all the so-called sensitive books on the Chinese government blacklist were taken off from their shelf, electronic shelf. And these are books written by Tibetan or Uyghur writers, very prominent writings, so it makes you, think what had happened behind the scenes, and I think that is a shame. Yeah.
Just one question okay, and this would be to you again, Mr. Chen. In an interview that you did just a couple of days ago, you underscored just how brutal the one-child per couple policy was, and you pointed out something that you asked that the press take note of, that while some may be under the impression that forced abortions only happen to those who have had more than one child, it's simply not true. If a family hasn't obtained a birth permit, whether it's their second or first child, the women are kidnapped and taken to a hospital where they are forced to have their babies killed. You point out that some of these are done in the 8 to 9 months of their pregnancies, and that you literally have to get permission, this is your quote, from the government to have your own child, even the one. And I think that's not largely recognized by a lot of people. They tell you when and if you could have your one. If you wanted to comment on that, these were your quotes, of course, but Mr. Chen, please do.
就是第一个，他说美国人都不知道，就觉得可以，就第二个会有危险。第一个没问题，比如说
在中国的计划生育部门呢，已经是成为一个强大的利益集团。官方公布数字是50万人，事实上他们在强迫堕胎的过程中，在执行暴力计生的时候，可能多达200万人参与。
Even the official figure says there are only 500,000 people participating in forced abortions, but that is probably around 2 million.
这个中国有一个叫一票否决的这个制度啊，就是说这个党委书记如果做不好这个计划生育问题，其他的做得再好也没有用，所以呢，他们就不择手段的去推行这个。
Because in China, they have this rule that the party secretary cannot do this well in the forced abortion. In terms of one-child policy, he cannot continue in his post.
那也就是说呢，他除了这个所谓的超生的要堕胎以外呢，这个即使是你一胎化，你在怀孕之前必须经这个计划生育办公室批准，他给你一个准生证，你才可以生。即使第一胎也是这样，如果你不经过他批准就已经怀孕的话，他就要你去堕胎，否则你就要给他很多钱。他有可能跟你说，哦，那既然什么呢，就给你再补一个证。但是很多在严厉的很多时候呢，他就是一定要让你去。这个他觉得呢，你这不是计划内的怀孕啊。
In order to meet the quota, so they not only abort the second child or third child, but also the first child in order to meet the quota. In order to have a child, you need to acquire a permit from the government. If they don't give it to you, you could bribe them with money.
Is there anything else any of our distinguished witnesses would like to conclude with? Mr. Kumar? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I just final word on this issue is, I mean, just when China just proudly announced their achievement of the last 40 years of forced, I mean, the population control and announced the 330 million abortions or children from being born, and most everybody knows most of them were forcibly aborted. I mean, this is almost the entire population of today's United States of America were wiped out basically, and I think I mean, this is perhaps the single most horrible the human rights violation, atrocities on this earth in the history, really, of human being. I think we should certainly, pay more attention and continue to urge the Chinese government to stop this policy. I think. Certainly, even in the past year, we know there are several high-profile cases that caught attention by some Chinese, by Chinese-owned citizens, and even some Chinese government-affiliate scholars publicly advocate to abandon this one-child policy. And for the long run, as Mr. Chairman pointed out, with the gender imbalance, the human trafficking, all this, even the ramification for the economic problems is not going to be sustainable, even for the best interest for China itself.
I do want to thank all of our distinguished witnesses. Chen Guangcheng, thank you for your extraordinary bravery. I can assure you that Chen Guangcheng will be a primary focus of this chairman, but as I know we'll be working side by side with members of both sides of the aisles, Democrat and Republican, on his behalf and on behalf of your family. You to speak out so bravely when you know your family has suffered so much should inspire each and every one of us to do much more than we have done months or years to date. So thank you for inspiring us as well. The hearing's adjourned. Oh. Did you want to say something?
Hey. Thank you.
It's not adjourned for a moment.